For nearly 2,000 years, one of the most famous statues ever built has been remembered in a way that is probably wrong. People imagine a giant bronze figure standing with its legs spread across a harbor, ships passing beneath it, a symbol so grand it feels almost mythic. Yet historians quietly agree that this image, repeated in paintings, books, and films, was almost certainly impossible. The strange truth is that one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world may be famous not for what it was, but for a version of it that never existed at all. If even a wonder of the ancient world can be misunderstood for centuries, then what exactly was the Colossus of Rhodes really like? Long before the Colossus of Rhodes became one of the most famous monuments of the ancient world, the island of Rhodes was already quietly shaping its place in the history of the Mediterranean. The story begins in the turbulent years that followed the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE. Alexander had built one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, stretching from Greece to Egypt and deep into Asia. Yet when he died unexpectedly in Babylon, the empire he created did not remain united for long. His generals, known later as the Diadochi, began competing with one another for control of the territories Alexander had conquered. Powerful kingdoms emerged from this struggle. In Egypt, Ptolemy established a dynasty that would rule for centuries. In the eastern regions, Seleucus created another vast realm. Macedonia and parts of Greece were controlled by other successors who were equally determined to expand their influence. The Mediterranean world became a landscape of shifting alliances, cautious diplomacy, and occasional war. Amid these powerful states stood the island of Rhodes. Located in the southeastern Aegean Sea, close to the coast of Anatolia, Rhodes occupied a remarkably strategic position. Ships traveling between the Greek world, the eastern Mediterranean, and Egypt often passed near its harbors. Geography alone gave the island a quiet but important advantage. Trade routes that connected grain from Egypt, timber from the north, luxury goods from the east, and wine and olive oil from the Greek mainland all crossed these waters. Rhodes gradually became a place where merchants, sailors, and travelers naturally gathered. Around 408 BCE, several older settlements on the island united to form the city of Rhodes itself. The city was carefully planned, with wide streets and an organized layout that reflected the growing sophistication of Greek urban design. Its harbors were protected, its shipyards were active, and its markets were busy with goods arriving from distant ports. Over time, Rhodes developed a reputation not only for commerce, but also for maritime skill. Rhodian sailors and shipbuilders were respected across the Mediterranean. Their ships carried goods and ideas across great distances, linking many cultures through quiet exchanges of trade. The people of Rhodes also cultivated a strong tradition of diplomacy. Rather than constantly seeking conquest, the city often focused on maintaining stability in the sea lanes that supported its prosperity. A peaceful sea meant safe trade, and safe trade meant wealth. For this reason, Rhodes sometimes acted as a mediator between larger powers, navigating the dangerous politics of the Hellenistic world with careful judgment. This balance required intelligence and patience. The island was not large, and its population was far smaller than that of the kingdoms surrounding it. Survival depended on making wise choices. During the early Hellenistic period, Rhodes developed particularly close ties with Ptolemaic Egypt. The alliance was mutually beneficial. Egypt depended on maritime trade across the Mediterranean, and Rhodes possessed one of the most capable navies in the region. By maintaining friendly relations, both powers strengthened their economic and political stability. Yet in a world shaped by ambitious rulers and constant competition, neutrality and diplomacy could only go so far. Other leaders of the Hellenistic age looked at Rhodes and saw something different. They saw a prosperous port city whose influence on trade routes gave it quiet power. Controlling Rhodes would mean controlling an important gateway of the eastern Mediterranean. Among those who recognized this strategic value was Demetrius Poliorcetes, one of the most famous and aggressive military commanders of the era. His name would soon become closely tied to the destiny of the island. The calm prosperity of Rhodes was about to face a severe test, one that would shape the events leading to the creation of a monument the world would remember for thousands of years. Yet at this moment in history, there was still no statue, no wonder of the ancient world, and no bronze giant watching over the harbor. There was only a small but confident maritime city, balancing trade, diplomacy, and survival in a Mediterranean world that rarely remained peaceful for long. As the decades passed after the death of Alexander the Great, the city of Rhodes continued to grow in quiet confidence. Its success did not come from conquest or territorial expansion. Instead, it came from something far more subtle and enduring: control of trade and mastery of the sea. The Rhodians understood that their island sat at a crossroads of the ancient world. To the south lay Egypt, whose fertile Nile Valley produced enormous quantities of grain that fed many Mediterranean cities. To the east were the ports of the Levant and the markets of Asia Minor. To the west were the Greek mainland and the islands of the Aegean. Ships traveling between these regions often passed near Rhodes, and the Rhodians gradually turned this geographic advantage into a sophisticated maritime economy. The harbors of Rhodes became increasingly active throughout the early Hellenistic period. Merchant vessels carrying grain, timber, metals, spices, textiles, and ceramics entered its ports. Some stayed only briefly before continuing their journeys, while others unloaded their cargo to be redistributed across the Aegean. Warehouses along the waterfront stored goods arriving from distant lands. Sailors speaking different languages walked the same quays. Markets filled with merchants negotiating prices for olive oil, wine, and precious materials. Trade in the ancient Mediterranean depended not only on geography, but also on trust, and Rhodes earned a reputation for reliability. One of the most important contributions the Rhodians made to commerce was the development of widely respected maritime customs that regulated shipping and cargo agreements. Ancient writers later referred to Rhodian maritime law as an authority in disputes involving trade and shipping. Although the surviving texts describing these laws come from later periods, historians widely accept that Rhodes played a major role in shaping commercial maritime practice in the Mediterranean. Merchants preferred ports where legal disputes could be settled fairly, and Rhodes offered that stability. In this way, law and commerce reinforced one another. Alongside commerce, Rhodes also invested heavily in naval strength. The Rhodian fleet was not built primarily for conquest but for protection. Piracy was a constant threat in the ancient Mediterranean, especially along busy trade routes. By maintaining a capable navy, Rhodes helped keep sea lanes safer for merchant vessels. This effort protected Rhodian trade, while also benefiting foreign merchants who relied on these routes. Over time, the Rhodian navy gained a reputation for discipline and efficiency. Their ships were respected for speed and maneuverability, and Rhodian sailors were known for their experience navigating the complex waters of the Aegean. These qualities made Rhodes an important ally for larger kingdoms whose economies depended on maritime trade. Among these relationships, the alliance with Ptolemaic Egypt was particularly important. Egypt exported vast quantities of grain throughout the Mediterranean, including to many Greek cities that could not produce enough food themselves. Rhodes helped facilitate this movement of goods through its shipping networks and naval protection. In return, Egypt provided political and economic support that strengthened Rhodes in a world dominated by powerful kingdoms. Through this partnership, Rhodes maintained both prosperity and a degree of independence. The wealth generated by trade gradually transformed the city itself. Harbors were expanded, public spaces improved, and temples maintained. Cultural life also flourished. Travelers, philosophers, and teachers passed through the island, bringing ideas from many regions of the Greek world. Rhodes eventually became known as a center for education, particularly in rhetoric and philosophy. Students traveled there to study communication and political thought. This intellectual reputation added another layer to the city's identity. Rhodes was no longer only a port of commerce, but also a place where knowledge circulated across the Mediterranean. Yet prosperity could attract attention. In the competitive world that followed Alexander's empire, wealth and strategic location often made cities targets for powerful rulers seeking influence. Control of Rhodes meant influence over sea routes connecting Greece, Egypt, and Asia Minor. For ambitious leaders, this position held enormous strategic value. The Rhodians understood this danger and continued practicing careful diplomacy. They avoided becoming fully dependent on any single power while maintaining alliances that protected their trade. For many years, this balance allowed Rhodes to remain both prosperous and independent. But the ambitions of certain commanders would soon challenge this stability. Among them was Demetrius, a military leader whose reputation for siege warfare was already spreading across the Mediterranean. His interest in Rhodes would soon bring the island face to face with one of the most dramatic military confrontations of the Hellenistic age. By the beginning of the 3rd century BCE, the balance that Rhodes had carefully maintained in the turbulent Hellenistic world was about to be tested. The island's prosperity, its strategic location, and its alliance with Ptolemaic Egypt had drawn the attention of one of the most ambitious military leaders of the era. His name was Demetrius, the son of Antigonus I Monophthalmus, one of the powerful successors who had inherited fragments of Alexander the Great's empire. Demetrius was already well known across the Mediterranean for his skill in warfare, especially in siegecraft. Later, historians would give him the title Poliorcetes, a Greek word meaning the besieger of cities. His reputation was built on his ability to attack fortified places with enormous machines and carefully planned strategies. In the struggle for power among the successors of Alexander, alliances often shifted quickly. Antigonus and his son Demetrius sought to strengthen their influence in the eastern Mediterranean, and controlling Rhodes would serve that goal. Rhodes had chosen to support Ptolemy of Egypt rather than Antigonus. For Demetrius, the island's refusal to break that alliance was both a political obstacle and an opportunity to demonstrate his military strength. In 305 BCE, Demetrius sailed toward Rhodes with a powerful fleet and a large army. Ancient sources describe hundreds of ships accompanying the expedition, carrying soldiers, engineers, and massive siege equipment. When the forces arrived, the Rhodians found themselves facing one of the most formidable military operations of their time. The city of Rhodes, however, was not unprepared. Its walls were strong, and its defenders were experienced. The people of Rhodes had long invested in fortifications and naval defense, precisely because they understood the dangers of their strategic position. What followed became one of the most famous sieges of the Hellenistic age. Demetrius established camps around the city and began constructing enormous siege engines designed to breach the defenses. Among the most remarkable of these machines was a towering structure known as the Helepolis, often translated as taker of cities. According to ancient descriptions recorded later by historians such as Diodorus Siculus, the Helepolis was an immense mobile siege tower covered with protective materials to resist arrows and fire. It was equipped with multiple levels for archers and artillery, allowing attackers to bombard defenders from above the city walls. The scale of these machines demonstrated both the engineering ambition of Hellenistic warfare and the determination of Demetrius to capture the city. The siege lasted many months, and the fighting was intense. Demetrius attempted to break through the walls using siege towers, battering rams, and artillery. At times, his forces succeeded in damaging sections of the defenses. Yet, the Rhodians responded with persistence and ingenuity. They repaired walls during the night, reinforced vulnerable sections, and organized their citizens to support the defense. The Rhodian navy also played a role by keeping sea routes open, allowing supplies to reach the city despite the siege. Their alliance with Ptolemy proved valuable as well. Ptolemaic support helped prevent Demetrius from completely isolating the island. In ancient warfare, sieges often depended on patience as much as strength. Armies surrounding a city hoped that time, hunger, or exhaustion would force surrender. But Rhodes refused to collapse under pressure. The determination of its defenders gradually transformed the siege into a test of endurance for both sides. The enormous machines built by Demetrius, impressive as they were, could not easily overcome a well-prepared city supported by allies and protected by the sea. After nearly a year of fighting, negotiations finally brought the conflict to an end. In 304 BCE, a peace agreement was reached. Rhodes agreed to remain neutral in the wider conflict among the successors of Alexander, but it preserved its independence and maintained its friendship with Egypt. For the Rhodians, survival itself was a remarkable victory. Demetrius withdrew his forces, leaving behind large quantities of siege equipment and materials that had been used during the campaign. The departure of the besieging army marked a turning point in the story of Rhodes. The island had faced one of the most powerful military forces of the era and had endured, yet the most unexpected consequence of the siege would come afterward. The abandoned machines and materials left behind by Demetrius would soon be transformed into something entirely different from instruments of war. They would become the foundation of a monument that would change the way the world remembered Rhodes. When the army of Demetrius finally withdrew from Rhodes in 304 BCE, the island entered a moment of quiet reflection. The siege had lasted nearly a year. The city walls had been tested, its citizens had endured uncertainty, and its defenders had faced one of the most formidable military commanders of the Hellenistic world. Yet the city still stood. Rhodes had survived not by overwhelming force, but through preparation, persistence, and the support of its allies. In the days that followed the departure of the besieging army, the landscape around the city revealed the scale of what had taken place. The camps of Demetrius were abandoned. Massive wooden structures, iron components, ropes, artillery frames, and other equipment remained scattered across the fields outside the walls. The enormous siege machines that had once threatened the city were now silent remnants of a failed campaign. For the Rhodians, these machines represented more than the memory of danger. They were also valuable materials. Bronze fittings, iron reinforcements, and heavy timbers had been used to construct the engines of war. Rather than leaving these resources to decay, the Rhodians made a practical decision. They dismantled the equipment left behind by the army of Demetrius and began selling the materials. Ancient sources later suggested that the sale of this captured war equipment produced a considerable sum of money. Although exact numbers are difficult to confirm with precision, the financial gain was large enough to support a project that would soon become famous across the Mediterranean world. The decision that followed was not purely economic, it carried symbolic meaning as well. The Rhodians chose to dedicate a monument to Helios, the sun god who had long been regarded as the divine protector of the island. In Rhodian tradition, Helios held a special place. According to Greek mythology, when the gods divided the world among themselves, Helios was absent and received no share of the land. Afterward, the island of Rhodes rose from the sea, and Helios claimed it as his own. Because of this story, the Rhodians believed their island was closely connected to the sun god. His image appeared on their coins, often shown with a radiant crown representing the rays of the sun. For generations, Helios had symbolized both protection and identity for the people of Rhodes. The victory over the siege gave the city a reason to express gratitude to this divine patron. Building a monument in honor of Helios allowed the Rhodians to transform a memory of war into a symbol of resilience. It also reflected a broader tradition in the Greek world. Cities frequently constructed temples, statues, or public monuments to commemorate victories or to thank the gods for protection during times of danger. These dedications were not simply acts of religion, they were also public statements about identity and pride. For Rhodes, which had defended its independence against a powerful invader, the moment carried particular significance. The idea of constructing a large statue dedicated to Helios began to take shape in this atmosphere of relief and celebration. Yet the Rhodians did not imagine an ordinary statue. The monument they envisioned would be extraordinary in scale. Ancient writers later described it as one of the largest statues ever attempted in the Greek world. Creating such a monument would require not only money, but also exceptional skill in engineering and sculpture. Bronze statues were already common in Greek art, but they were usually far smaller. Constructing a figure that would rise high above the harbor landscape demanded careful planning and technical expertise. To lead the project, the Rhodians turned to a sculptor named Chares of Lindos. Chares came from Lindos, one of the older cities on the island of Rhodes, and he was known for his artistic training within the Greek sculptural tradition. He had studied under Lysippos, a renowned sculptor who had worked during the time of Alexander the Great. Lysippos was famous for creating statues that emphasized realistic proportions and dynamic posture. Through this artistic lineage, Chares inherited both technical knowledge and a connection to one of the most respected sculptural schools of the era. The choice of Chares suggests that the Rhodians intended the monument to be both technically ambitious and artistically significant. At this moment in history, however, the statue did not yet exist. There were only plans, materials from dismantled siege engines, and the determination of a city that had just survived one of the greatest threats it had ever faced. The project that would later be called the Colossus of Rhodes was about to begin, and its construction would soon challenge the limits of ancient engineering. The decision to build a monument to Helios was not made lightly. In the Greek world, statues of gods were common, but the scale the Rhodians envisioned was something unusual. Most religious statues stood inside temples or within public sanctuaries. They honored the gods through beauty, symbolism, and careful craftsmanship. Yet, the monument planned in Rhodes would be something different. It would not simply decorate a sanctuary. It would rise above the city itself, visible from afar, a reminder of survival after danger and a declaration of the island's identity. To understand why the Rhodians chose Helios for such a monument, it helps to look more closely at the place the sun god held in their traditions. In Greek mythology, Helios was the divine figure who drove the chariot of the sun across the sky each day, bringing light to the world. While many Greek cities honored gods such as Athena, Apollo, or Zeus as their principal protector, Rhodes maintained a particularly strong association with Helios. The island's connection to the sun god appeared not only in stories but also in everyday symbols. Coins minted in Rhodes during the Hellenistic period frequently depicted the head of Helios crowned with rays of sunlight. These coins circulated widely throughout Mediterranean trade networks, carrying the image of the Rhodian patron god far beyond the island itself. Ancient writers also preserved a myth explaining this connection. According to the story, recorded by later Greek authors, when the Olympian gods divided the world among themselves, Helios was absent and received no land. After the division had already taken place, a new island rose from the sea. Helios claimed this island as his own, and that island was Rhodes. Whether the story was understood as myth or tradition, it reinforced the idea that the island and the sun god were closely linked. For the people of Rhodes, honoring Helios after surviving the siege felt natural. The monument would express gratitude to the deity they believed had watched over their city during the crisis. Yet gratitude alone does not explain the extraordinary scale of the project. The Rhodians also understood the symbolic power of monuments. Throughout the Greek world, cities used public art and architecture to communicate identity, pride, and achievement. A large statue could express strength without the need for words. In the aftermath of the siege, Rhodes had something important to say. The city had resisted one of the most powerful military campaigns of the Hellenistic age and had preserved its independence. Building a remarkable monument would allow the Rhodians to transform a moment of danger into a lasting statement of resilience. The location of the statue was also carefully considered. While later artistic traditions often imagined the Colossus standing directly across the entrance of the harbor with ships sailing between its legs, historians generally agree that such a position would have been extremely difficult to construct and impractical for a busy port. Ancient sources do not clearly describe the statue straddling the harbor entrance. Instead, many scholars believe the monument likely stood near the harbor area or on elevated ground, where it could be seen from ships approaching the city. This placement would still allow the statue to greet sailors and merchants arriving in Rhodes while remaining structurally possible for ancient builders. For travelers crossing the eastern Mediterranean, the sight of a monumental bronze statue near the harbor would have made a powerful impression. The choice of bronze itself was significant. Bronze statues were admired in Greek art because the material allowed sculptors to create lifelike forms with fine detail and balanced proportions. However, large bronze statues were technically difficult to produce. The process required casting sections of metal and assembling them with internal supports. The larger the statue became, the more complex the engineering challenges would be. Creating a statue on the scale envisioned in Rhodes required a careful combination of sculpture, architecture, and mechanical skill. The Rhodians entrusted this task to Chares of Lindos, whose training under the sculptor Lysippos connected him to one of the most respected artistic traditions of the time. Lysippos had been known for experimenting with proportion and movement in sculpture, seeking a more natural representation of the human form. Through this lineage, Chares possessed both artistic knowledge and technical experience that would be necessary for such an ambitious project. Even so, the plan to build a statue of this size would require more than artistic skill. It would demand careful organization, labor, materials, and time. The Rhodians were preparing to attempt something that few cities had ever tried before. In the years that followed, workers, craftsmen, and engineers would gradually transform raw materials into one of the most remarkable monuments of the ancient world. At the beginning of this project, however, the statue existed only as an idea shared among the people of Rhodes, a vision of a shining figure of Helios that would rise above the city and remind future generations of the moment when their island refused to fall. As the plans for the monument continued to develop, the Rhodians faced a question that would shape the future of the project. How large should the statue be? In the Greek world, statues of gods were familiar sights in temples and sanctuaries, yet most were modest in scale, compared with the vision now taking shape in Rhodes. Bronze statues might stand several meters high, sometimes placed on stone bases to give them greater presence, but the idea forming in the minds of the Rhodians was far more ambitious. They wanted a statue that would not merely decorate the city but define it. The monument would become a visible sign of gratitude, independence, and endurance. Ancient writers later described the height of the statue as roughly 70 cubits, which corresponds to about 32 to 33 meters, or just over 100 feet. In the context of the ancient world, this was an extraordinary scale for a bronze figure. Even many centuries later, statues approaching that size would remain rare. For the people of Rhodes, choosing such a height meant committing themselves to a project that would require patience, engineering skill, and significant resources. Yet the decision also reflected confidence. Rhodes had survived a major military threat, and its prosperity from maritime trade allowed the city to support ambitious undertakings. The statue would express both gratitude to Helios and the resilience of the community that had defended the island. The location of the monument, near the harbor area of the city, was chosen with care. Rhodes depended on maritime activity, and the harbor formed the gateway through which travelers, merchants, and sailors entered the city. Placing a monumental statue in a position visible from the sea ensured that anyone approaching Rhodes would immediately encounter the symbol of the island's identity. The statue of Helios would not only be a religious dedication, but also a visual landmark for ships crossing the eastern Mediterranean. Visitors arriving by sea would see the shining figure rising above the city's skyline, reflecting sunlight from its bronze surface. Over time, this visibility would help the monument gain fame far beyond the island itself. Choosing bronze as the primary material also required careful consideration. Bronze offered advantages that made it attractive for sculpture. It was strong, relatively flexible compared with stone, and capable of holding detailed shapes. Greek sculptors had long admired bronze statues because they could portray natural movement and realistic anatomy more effectively than many stone carvings. Yet bronze was also expensive and difficult to work with on a large scale. The metal had to be melted, cast into sections, and assembled over a supporting structure. In smaller statues, this process was already demanding. At the scale envisioned for the Colossus, the technical challenges multiplied. Each section would need to be carefully designed so that the weight of the metal did not collapse the structure. The internal framework supporting the statue would have to carry enormous loads while maintaining balance and stability. The sculptor, Chares of Lindos, therefore faced a task that combined artistic vision with engineering complexity. Ancient writers later associated Ceres with the sculptural tradition of Lysippos, whose works were admired for their careful proportions and lifelike posture. Although the Colossus would represent a god rather than an ordinary human figure, the principles of balance and proportion remained essential. A statue of this size could not simply be enlarged from a smaller model without careful planning. The distribution of weight, the placement of the legs, the position of the arms, and the alignment of the torso all required precise calculation. Without that planning, the structure could fail during construction or collapse under its own mass. Building such a monument also meant organizing a large workforce. Craftsmen skilled in metalwork, stone construction, carpentry, and lifting mechanisms would all contribute to the project. Materials had to be gathered and transported. Bronze would be cast in sections, internal supports installed, and the outer surfaces shaped and assembled piece by piece. Ancient accounts suggest that the construction lasted about 12 years, beginning around 292 BCE and reaching completion roughly in 280 BCE. Such a long timeline reflects both the scale of the undertaking and the careful pace required to avoid structural failure. Over these years, the rising figure of Helios would gradually become visible above the city. At first, only foundations and scaffolding might be seen, but as construction advanced, the statue slowly took form. For the citizens of Rhodes, watching the monument grow must have been a powerful reminder of their survival after the siege. What had begun as abandoned siege equipment and dismantled war machines was being transformed into something entirely different, a monumental figure dedicated to light, endurance, and divine protection. By the time the statue neared completion, it had already become more than a local project. Word of the immense bronze figure rising above Rhodes spread across the Mediterranean through merchants and travelers who visited the island's busy harbor. The statue had not yet become a wonder of the world, but it was already attracting curiosity and admiration. The Rhodians had set out to honor their patron god, yet the monument they were creating would soon capture the imagination of people far beyond their island. Once the decision had been made and the project placed in the hands of Ceres of Lindos, the next challenge was no longer symbolic or political. It was practical. How could craftsmen of the ancient world construct a bronze statue taller than any figure they had built before? The answer did not come from a single invention, but from a careful combination of techniques that Greek artisans had gradually refined over centuries. Bronze sculpture was already a respected art in the classical Greek world. Many statues of athletes, heroes, and gods had been created using bronze, particularly during the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. Yet most of these statues were human-sized or only slightly larger. The Colossus of Rhodes would require those familiar methods to be expanded to a scale that tested their limits. The fundamental process behind bronze sculpture involved casting metal in separate pieces rather than pouring an entire statue at once. Molten bronze, created by melting copper and tin together, was poured into molds shaped to form parts of the statue. When the metal cooled and hardened, the molds were removed, leaving the bronze pieces ready to be refined and assembled. This technique allowed sculptors to create detailed forms, but it also meant that large statues had to be built gradually, piece by piece. For the Colossus, this principle became essential. Ancient descriptions suggest that the statue was constructed using bronze plates attached to an internal structure. Inside the figure, iron bars likely formed a supporting framework. Stones may have been placed within parts of the statue to add weight and stability. These elements helped distribute the enormous load created by the bronze surface. Without such reinforcement, the statue could not have stood upright for long. The builders therefore approached the project as both sculpture and architecture. The outer surface represented the artistic form of Helios, while the inner framework functioned like the hidden skeleton of a building. Another challenge was the simple question of height. Reaching more than 30 meters above the ground meant that workers needed a way to operate safely at increasing levels. Ancient writers suggested that the builders may have used large earthen ramps during construction. As the statue rose higher, earth could be piled around the structure, allowing craftsmen to work from solid ground rather than from unstable scaffolding. When a section of the statue was completed, the earth around it could be raised further so that the next level could be built. This method had already been used in other large construction projects in the ancient world, including monumental buildings and fortifications. By gradually raising the working surface, the builders could shape and assemble bronze sections while standing close to the area they were constructing. The process was slow but effective. Each part of the statue had to be carefully aligned so that the final figure maintained balance. If the distribution of weight shifted too far in one direction, the entire structure could become unstable. The legs, which supported the full mass of the statue, required especially careful planning. They had to be wide and strong enough to carry the load of the torso, arms, and head above them. Because bronze statues were hollow rather than solid, the thickness of the metal also had to be controlled. Too thin, and the metal might bend or crack. Too thick, and the weight would become difficult for the internal framework to support. Achieving the right balance required both experience and careful judgment. The construction would have demanded the cooperation of many different craftsmen. Metalworkers shaped and cast the bronze sections. Stoneworkers prepared foundations capable of carrying the statue's weight. Carpenters helped create molds and lifting mechanisms. Engineers and laborers coordinated the movement of heavy materials. The building of the Colossus therefore represented not only artistic ambition, but also a collective effort involving many skilled workers. Over time, as the statue slowly rose above the city, the people of Rhodes could watch the progress of a monument that few communities had ever attempted before. The work required patience. Years passed as one section followed another. The lower parts of the statue were completed first, gradually supporting the sections above. As construction continued, the outline of the figure began to emerge. From a distance, ships approaching the harbor would have seen the form of Helios slowly taking shape against the sky. Yet even as the builders advanced step by step, they were navigating a difficult challenge. Creating a statue of such scale meant pushing the boundaries of the technology available to them. The success of the project would depend on whether those methods could support the immense bronze figure once it finally stood complete. As the structure of the Colossus continued to rise, the greatest challenge facing its builders was not simply casting bronze or shaping the image of Helios. The true difficulty lay in balance. A statue more than 30 meters tall could not stand safely unless its weight was distributed with extraordinary care. In smaller sculptures, balance could be achieved through experience and artistic intuition. But when a figure reached the height of a multi-story building, even small miscalculations could threaten the entire structure. The builders, therefore, had to think like engineers as much as artists. The stability of the statue began with its base. A foundation of stone was necessary to support the enormous weight above it. Although the exact design of the base has not survived, historians generally agree that the statue stood on a solid platform, likely constructed from large blocks of stone. This base anchored the internal structure of the statue and spread its weight across the ground below. Without such a foundation, the bronze figure could slowly shift or sink, especially in a coastal environment where soil conditions could change over time. Above this base, the internal framework of the statue formed the hidden support system that held the figure upright. Ancient descriptions, including those later summarized by writers such as Philo of Byzantium, suggest that iron bars were used inside the statue to reinforce the bronze shell. These iron elements acted like the internal skeleton of the monument. They connected different parts of the statue and helped transfer weight downward toward the foundation. Around these metal supports, stones may have been placed in certain areas of the structure to add stability. The use of stone inside the statue might seem surprising at first, but it served an important purpose. The additional mass lowered the center of gravity of the monument, helping prevent the statue from swaying or shifting in strong winds. One of the most critical structural decisions concerned the position of the legs. The legs had to support the entire mass of the statue, including the torso, arms, and head rising high above the ground. Later artistic images often show the Colossus standing with its legs spread widely across the harbor entrance. While this image became popular in later centuries, historians widely consider it unrealistic for ancient construction methods. A stance that wide would have placed enormous stress on the statue's structure and would likely have made construction extremely difficult. Instead, most scholars believe the statue stood with its legs closer together, perhaps in a stable, upright pose similar to other Greek statues of gods and heroes. Such a position would have allowed the weight of the statue to travel more directly through the legs into the base below. This arrangement made structural sense for a bronze monument of such height. The arms of the statue also required careful consideration. Some artistic reconstructions suggest that one arm may have been raised, possibly holding a symbolic object or shading the eyes while looking toward the sea. Yet, there is no surviving ancient description that confirms the exact pose with certainty. What historians do agree upon is that the arms could not extend too far from the body without additional support. Bronze, while strong, can bend or fracture if large sections project outward without reinforcement. The sculptor and builders therefore had to design a posture that balanced artistic expression with structural safety. The head and upper torso presented their own challenges. As the statue rose higher, the bronze sections being installed had to remain precisely aligned with the framework below. Even a slight misalignment could shift weight in ways that might weaken the structure over time. Workers assembling the upper sections had to ensure that each new piece connected securely with the existing framework. The earthen ramps surrounding the statue likely played an important role during this phase of construction. By gradually raising the level of the earth around the monument, workers could reach higher sections without relying entirely on tall scaffolding. This technique allowed them to transport heavy materials upward while maintaining relatively stable working surfaces. The process was slow, but it allowed the builders to maintain control over each stage of the construction. As the statue grew taller, its silhouette would have become visible across greater distances. Sailors approaching Rhodes may have watched the gradual emergence of the bronze figure over several years. At first, only the lower sections might have been visible above the surrounding earthworks. Later, the torso appeared, followed eventually by the head, crowned with rays symbolizing the sun god. The construction, therefore, unfolded not as a single dramatic moment, but as a gradual transformation of the skyline of Rhodes. Each year brought the statue closer to completion, while also testing the abilities of the craftsmen responsible for its creation. The builders were attempting something that few societies had attempted before, a bronze statue on a monumental scale, rising above a thriving port city. Success required careful coordination between art, engineering, and patience. Every decision about structure, weight, and balance carried long-term consequences. By the time the statue approached its full height, the Colossus was already becoming one of the most remarkable achievements of Hellenistic craftsmanship. The construction of the Colossus of Rhodes did not happen quickly. Unlike many monuments that are completed within a few years, this statue required patience on a different scale. Ancient writers indicate that the work lasted roughly 12 years, beginning sometime around 292 BCE and reaching completion around 280 BCE. For more than a decade, the people of Rhodes lived alongside the slow emergence of the monument that would later become one of the most famous creations of the ancient world. In the early years of construction, like a finished figure, foundations had to be prepared first, arranged to create a state remain balanced. The internal framework of iron supports was then anchored into this base, forming the hidden structure that would hold the statue upright. At this stage, the monument may have appeared more like a skeletal framework rising from the ground than a recognizable statue. Gradually, bronze sections were added around this internal structure. Each piece had to be cast separately and then transported into position. The casting process itself required specialized furnaces capable of melting large quantities of metal. Craftsmen poured molten bronze into carefully shaped molds, creating curved plates that would later become the outer surface of the statue. Once cooled, these bronze sections were polished, adjusted, and prepared for installation. Workers then lifted them into place using ropes, pulleys, and simple mechanical lifting devices available in the Hellenistic world. As the lower parts of the statue were assembled, the structure began to resemble the legs and lower body of the god Helios. The surrounding earthen ramps, which may have been used to support the construction process, gradually rose higher as new sections were added. This allowed workers to reach the growing monument without needing extremely tall scaffolding. From the outside, the statue slowly transformed from a framework into a recognizable human form. Years passed as one layer followed another. The torso eventually emerged above the city skyline. The shoulders and arms followed. Finally, the head was placed at the top of the structure, likely crowned with rays representing the sun. For the citizens of Rhodes, the gradual appearance of the statue must have been a remarkable sight. The monument was not hidden behind walls or inside a temple. It stood near the harbor, where daily life unfolded around it. Merchants arriving with cargo, sailors preparing their ships, and travelers passing through the port would all have seen the statue rising year after year. The construction, therefore, became part of the rhythm of the city. Children growing up during those 12 years may have watched the monument grow taller as they themselves grew older. The project also required steady coordination between different groups of workers. Metal workers cast the bronze sections. Builders maintained the ramps and foundations. Laborers transported materials. Supervisors ensured that the alignment of the statue remained correct as its height increased. Because even small structural errors could threaten the entire monument, each stage had to be completed carefully before the next could begin. By the final stages of construction, the statue had already become a symbol of the city that built it. Travelers who visited Rhodes during these years carried stories of the rising bronze giant to other parts of the Mediterranean. Trade routes carried not only goods, but also news. Merchants spoke about the remarkable statue taking shape on the island of Rhodes. In this way, the monument began to attract attention even before it was finished. When the Colossus was finally completed around 280 BCE, it stood as one of the tallest statues known in the ancient world. Rising roughly 32 meters above its base, the bronze figure of Helios looked out across the harbor and the surrounding sea. The polished surface of the metal would have reflected sunlight during the day, reinforcing the connection between the statue and the sun god it represented. For the Rhodians, the completion of the statue marked more than the end of a construction project. It represented the transformation of war into remembrance and danger into identity. What had begun with the abandoned machines of a failed siege had become a monument that would soon be counted among the wonders of the ancient world. For many centuries, artists and storytellers imagined the Colossus of Rhodes in a very dramatic way. In paintings, engravings, and later illustrations, the statue often appears standing with its legs stretched across the entrance of the harbor, forming a gateway for ships sailing beneath it. The image is striking. A giant bronze figure straddling the sea while vessels pass between its feet creates a scene that feels almost mythical. This version of the Colossus became so popular that it appeared in books, museums, and even modern films. Yet when historians examine the surviving ancient sources, a quieter and more complicated picture begins to emerge. The famous image of the statue standing across the harbor is almost certainly a creation of later imagination rather than historical fact. The earliest written descriptions of the Colossus do not mention ships passing between its legs or a stance that wide across the harbor entrance. Ancient writers such as Strabo and Pliny the Elder discussed the statue and its size, but they did not describe it straddling the harbor. Instead, their comments suggest a monumental statue standing on land, likely near the harbor, but not over it. This difference may seem small at first, yet it changes the way historians understand the monument. To imagine the statue across the harbor entrance raises immediate practical questions. The harbor of Rhodes was an active commercial port. Ships constantly entered and left the harbor carrying goods from across the Mediterranean. Building a massive statue directly over the passageway would have created serious problems for navigation and safety. Construction alone would have required closing the harbor for many years, something that would have severely damaged the Rhodian economy, which depended on maritime trade. Even more important were the structural challenges. The distance across the harbour entrance would likely have been far too wide for a bronze statue of that era to support itself safely. Bronze, while strong, still has limits when used in large, unsupported spans. A statue with legs spread widely across a harbour would place tremendous stress on the metal and the internal framework. The technology available in the 3rd century BCE simply makes such a structure extremely unlikely. Because of these issues, most modern historians and archaeologists believe the Colossus stood on solid ground near the harbour rather than above it. Several possible locations have been suggested, including areas near the ancient harbour of Mandraki. From such a position, the statue would still have been visible to ships approaching the city. Sailors entering the harbour could have seen the bronze figure of Helios rising above the buildings of Rhodes, shining in the sunlight. This placement would have allowed the statue to serve as a symbolic guardian of the harbour without interfering with the daily movement of ships. Ancient writers also describe the statue in ways that support a more stable, upright pose. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, noted that the statue stood 70 cubits tall and that even after it fell, few people could wrap their arms around one of its fingers. This description emphasizes size rather than dramatic posture. It suggests a statue designed primarily to impress viewers through its scale rather than through an extreme architectural pose. The Rhodians were skilled engineers, but they were also practical builders who understood the limits of materials. A stable stance with legs relatively close together would have allowed the internal structure of iron supports and stone reinforcement to distribute weight more effectively. Such a pose would resemble other large statues of gods from the Greek world, where balance and proportion were essential to structural survival. Over time, however, the image of the harbour-straddling statue proved too powerful for artists to resist. During the Renaissance and later centuries, European illustrators began depicting the Colossus in increasingly dramatic ways. These images helped shape the popular imagination of the monument, even though they were created nearly 2,000 years after the statue itself had been built. As a result, many people today picture a version of the Colossus that likely never existed. The real statue may have been less theatrical, but it was no less remarkable. Standing near the harbour, the bronze figure of Helios would still have towered above the city and the sea, a reminder of the moment when Rhodes endured one of the greatest challenges in its history. If the Colossus did not stand across the harbour, then what might it actually have looked like? Historians cannot reconstruct the statue with complete certainty, because no detailed ancient description of its exact pose has survived. The statue disappeared long ago, and only a few written references remain. Yet by combining those references with knowledge of Greek sculpture and ancient engineering, scholars can form a careful picture of what the monument may have looked like when it stood above the city of Rhodes. The statue represented Helios, the sun god, and this identity would have shaped many of its visual features. In Rhodian art and coinage from the Hellenistic period, Helios was typically shown as a youthful figure with a radiant crown of sun rays extending outward from his head. This crown symbolized the light of the sun spreading across the sky. Coins produced in Rhodes during the centuries around the construction of the statue display this image clearly, the face of Helios framed by stylized rays. Because the Colossus was intended as a dedication to the island's patron deity, it is very likely that the statue followed a similar visual tradition. At the top of the monument, the head of Helios may have worn a crown shaped like a circle of bronze rays, reflecting sunlight as the day progressed. The posture of the statue was probably calm and balanced rather than dramatic. Greek sculptors valued harmony and proportion in their work. Statues of gods were often designed to express strength through stability rather than movement. A stable, upright pose would also have helped the builders maintain the structural balance required for a monument of such height. The legs were likely positioned relatively close together, allowing the weight of the statue to pass directly downward through the internal framework to the base. This arrangement would have reduced stress on the bronze plates and iron supports inside the structure. The upper body of the statue may have shown Helios looking outward toward the sea. Rhodes depended heavily on maritime trade, and the harbour represented the connection between the island and the wider Mediterranean world. If the statue stood near the harbor area, the direction of its gaze may have symbolically faced the open waters from which merchants and travelers arrived. In some artistic reconstructions created by modern historians, Helios is shown raising one arm to shade his eyes while looking toward the horizon, as if watching ships approaching the island. This gesture would fit the role of a divine protector, observing the sea. However, it is important to remember that this detail remains speculative. Ancient sources do not describe the exact position of the arms. The clothing of the statue may also have followed traditional Greek artistic patterns. Helios might have been depicted either partially draped in a cloak or with the upper body exposed in the style of heroic sculpture. Greek statues often combined idealized anatomy with simple garments that flowed naturally across the body. Bronze, as a material, allowed sculptors to create detailed folds in fabric and lifelike contours in the human form. The outer surface of the Colossus would have reflected sunlight throughout the day, giving the impression that the figure of the sun god itself was glowing above the city. Equally important was the statue's position within the landscape of Rhodes. Most historians believe the Colossus stood somewhere near the harbor district, possibly on elevated ground, that allowed it to be seen from ships entering the port. From such a location, the statue could dominate the skyline without interfering with maritime traffic. Sailors approaching the island would have seen the bronze figure rising above the walls and buildings of the city. Even from a distance, the glint of sunlight on bronze might have made the statue visible long before ships reached the harbor. For visitors arriving in Rhodes, the experience must have been memorable. After days at sea, the sight of a massive bronze statue representing the island's patron god would have signaled that they were entering a prosperous and confident city. The Colossus did not need to stand across the harbor to create a powerful impression. Its height alone, combined with its location near the waterfront, ensured that it dominated the visual landscape of the city. Although the exact appearance of the statue remains uncertain, the available evidence suggests something both grand and dignified. A towering bronze figure of Helios, standing upright near the harbor, crowned with rays of sunlight and facing the sea that sustained the life of Rhodes. Even without the dramatic pose imagined in later centuries, such a monument would have been extraordinary for its time. For travelers approaching Rhodes during the early 3rd century BCE, the first impression of the city would have come from the sea. Ships sailing across the eastern Mediterranean often spent days or even weeks moving slowly between islands and coastal ports. Navigation depended on winds, currents, and careful observation of the shoreline. When the island of Rhodes finally appeared on the horizon, sailors would have seen a landscape shaped by both nature and human activity. Hills rising behind the coastline, stone walls protecting the harbor, and a busy port where vessels arrived from many regions of the Mediterranean world. Among these familiar features of a prosperous harbor city stood something far more unusual. Rising above the harbor district was the immense bronze figure of Helios, the Colossus of Rhodes. For sailors approaching the island, the statue would likely have become visible long before the details of the city itself could be clearly seen. Bronze surfaces exposed to sunlight often produce a bright reflection, especially when polished. Under the clear skies of the Aegean, the statue may have appeared to glow in the distance as sunlight struck its metal surface. As ships moved closer to the harbor, the scale of the monument would gradually reveal itself. What first appeared as a distant, shining figure would slowly transform into the recognizable shape of a towering human form standing above the city. Ancient writers did not leave detailed descriptions of the emotional reactions of travelers who saw the statue for the first time, but it is not difficult to imagine the sense of surprise it might have produced. The ancient Mediterranean world contained many impressive temples and public buildings, yet statues of this scale were extremely rare. Even experienced sailors who had visited many ports may have found themselves looking upward in quiet amazement as their ships entered the harbor of Rhodes. The statue did not exist in isolation. It stood within the living environment of a thriving city. Around it were warehouses storing goods from distant lands, shipyards repairing vessels, and markets where merchants negotiated trade. The harbor itself was constantly active, Ships from Egypt might arrive, carrying grain harvested along the Nile. Vessels from the islands of the Aegean brought wine, pottery, and olive oil. Traders from Asia Minor transported textiles, metals, and crafted goods. The presence of the Colossus above this activity connected the daily life of commerce with the symbolic identity of the island. Helios, the divine patron of Rhodes, appeared to watch over the harbor that sustained the city's prosperity. Visitors who stepped onto the docks and entered the city would experience the monument from another perspective. Standing at ground level near the base of the statue, the true scale of the Colossus would become even more apparent. Ancient sources describe the enormous size of its features. Pliny the Elder later wrote that even when the statue had fallen, few people could wrap their arms around one of its fingers. This description suggests that each part of the statue was built on a scale far larger than ordinary human proportions. The fingers, the feet, and the folds of the statue's cloak would all have appeared monumental when viewed from nearby streets. For the citizens of Rhodes, the statue likely became a familiar presence over time. What initially felt extraordinary may gradually have blended into the background of daily life. People walking through the harbor district to conduct business, repair ships, or attend markets would pass beneath the towering figure of Helios without necessarily pausing to consider its full scale. Yet even familiarity could not entirely erase the monument's symbolic meaning. The Colossus represented the memory of a moment when the city had faced danger and survived. It stood as a reminder that Rhodes had defended its independence against a powerful, invading army. For travelers and merchants, the statue carried another meaning as well. It signaled that Rhodes was a confident and prosperous city. In the competitive world of the Hellenistic Mediterranean, public monuments were often used to communicate prestige. The Colossus told visitors that the island possessed both wealth and technical skill. It also revealed the Rhodians' ability to transform the aftermath of war into a symbol of endurance. Over time, stories about the statue began to circulate beyond the island itself. Sailors leaving Rhodes carried descriptions of the enormous bronze figure to other ports across the Mediterranean. Merchants spoke of the statue when recounting their journeys. Travelers who had seen the monument described it to audiences who had never visited the island. In this way, the fame of the Colossus gradually spread across the ancient world. Long before it was formally listed among the Seven Wonders, the statue had already become something remarkable in the imagination of those who heard about it. The bronze figure of Helios standing above the harbor of Rhodes did not merely represent a god, it represented a city that had survived, adapted, and chosen to express its identity through one of the most ambitious monuments of the ancient world. For many years after its completion around 280 BCE, the Colossus of Rhodes stood quietly above the harbor while the life of the city unfolded beneath it. Unlike monuments that are isolated in temples or distant sanctuaries, the statue existed within the daily rhythm of an active port. Rhodes was not only a political community, but also one of the most important commercial centers in the eastern Mediterranean. The harbor remained the heart of this activity. From sunrise until evening, ships entered and left the port carrying goods, passengers, and news from across the sea. Grain ships from Egypt often arrived heavily loaded, bringing one of the most essential resources of the ancient Mediterranean world. Timber from northern regions, metals from Asia Minor, and luxury goods from the eastern markets also passed through the city. The presence of the Colossus above this harbor meant that the statue became part of the ordinary landscape experienced by sailors, merchants, and residents alike. For a sailor approaching Rhodes, the statue likely served as a visual landmark long before the details of the city became clear. In the ancient world, navigation often relied on recognizable features along the coastline. A large monument, visible from the sea, could help guide ships toward a safe harbor. The bronze figure of Helios, standing high above the port, would have offered exactly that kind of reference point. As sunlight reflected from its surface during the day, the statue may have appeared almost luminous against the blue sky of the Aegean. For sailors who spent long days watching the horizon, the sight of Rhodes and its towering statue may have signaled both the end of a difficult journey and the arrival at a reliable trading port. Once ships entered the harbor, life on the docks was busy and organized. Workers unloaded cargo, sailors repaired sails and ropes, and merchants negotiated prices for goods arriving from distant regions. Warehouses near the waterfront stored large quantities of grain, wine, oil, and other products before they were distributed to markets across the Mediterranean. The harbor district also contained workshops where craftsmen built and repaired ships. Rhodes had long been known for its shipbuilding and naval expertise, and the city continued to maintain a capable fleet that protected its trade routes from piracy. While this constant activity filled the harbor with noise and movement, the statue of Helios stood above it in stillness, overlooking the same waters that had once brought an invading army to the island. Citizens of Rhodes gradually grew accustomed to the presence of the monument. For children growing up in the city, the statue may have seemed like a permanent feature of the landscape, something that had always existed above the harbor. People walking through the streets near the port could see the towering bronze figure from many angles as sunlight shifted throughout the day. During clear mornings, the statue might cast long shadows across nearby buildings. At midday, its bronze surfaces could appear bright under the strong Mediterranean sun. In the evening, as the light softened and ships returned to harbor, the figure of Helios would remain visible against the fading sky. Despite its familiarity, the statue never completely lost its symbolic meaning. The citizens of Rhodes understood why it had been built. It was a reminder of the siege that had threatened the city decades earlier and of the determination that had allowed the island to survive. The monument also represented gratitude toward Helios, the divine protector whom the Rhodians believed had watched over them during that time of danger. In this way, the statue carried both historical and religious significance. Public festivals and religious ceremonies dedicated to Helios were part of the cultural life of Rhodes, and the presence of the Colossus strengthened the connection between the city and its patron deity. Visitors arriving in Rhodes would often hear the story behind the statue soon after entering the city. Merchants and sailors exchanging news in marketplaces shared stories about the siege and the construction of the monument. Guides or local residents may have explained how the abandoned siege machines of Demetrius had been dismantled and sold to finance the statue. These stories helped transform the monument into more than a piece of architecture. It became a narrative about resilience, reminding listeners that the statue existed because the city had refused to surrender. Over the years, the fame of the Colossus spread gradually across the Mediterranean world. Travelers who visited Rhodes carried descriptions of the monument to other ports and cities. These stories circulated along trade routes that connected Greece, Egypt, and the Eastern Mediterranean. In an age when information traveled slowly, such accounts played an important role in shaping reputation. The Colossus became known not only as a large statue, but also as a symbol of the ingenuity and determination of the Rhodian people. Long before later writers would formally list it among the wonders of the world, the monument had already captured the imagination of those who heard about it. For the people who lived in Rhodes during these decades, however, the statue was simply part of their city. It stood quietly above the harbor, watching over ships and markets, day after day, year after year. Few could have imagined that the life of the monument itself would be far shorter than the memory it would leave behind. As the years passed, Rhodes continued to strengthen its position as one of the most active trading centers in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the presence of the Colossus became closely connected with this reputation. The statue did not function as a fortress or a defensive structure. It did not control ships or protect the harbor with weapons. Yet its influence was visible in a different way. It symbolized stability. For merchants who traveled long distances across uncertain waters, the sight of a powerful and organized city mattered. Ports where trade was secure and disputes could be resolved fairly were far more attractive than places where piracy or political instability threatened cargo and crews. Rhodes had already built its reputation on reliable maritime law and naval protection, but the towering figure of Helios reinforced the impression that this was a city confident in its place within the Mediterranean world. In many ways, the statue served as a visual introduction to the character of Rhodes itself. Ships arriving from Egypt, Cyprus, the Levant, and the Greek mainland entered a harbor that was not only busy but also orderly. Ancient sources often describe Rhodes as a city known for its disciplined administration and strong civic institutions. The Rhodians had developed legal practices governing maritime trade that later writers associated with what became known as the Rhodian Sea Law. Although the surviving legal texts were written centuries later, the reputation of Rhodes as an authority on maritime commerce was already well established during the Hellenistic period. Merchants arriving in the harbor understood that contracts, cargo agreements, and shipping disputes could be handled within a framework of established rules. This legal stability played an important role in attracting traders from across the region. While commerce moved through the harbor, the Colossus stood nearby as a silent witness to the movement of goods and people. Its bronze surface reflected the same sunlight that illuminated the sails of ships entering the port. From the decks of these vessels, sailors could look toward the city and see the immense figure of Helios rising above the harbor district. The statue did not merely decorate the skyline, it reinforced the identity of Rhodes as a city protected by its patron god and strengthened by its own determination. For foreign visitors, the monument carried a message that was both religious and political. It suggested that the city had both divine favor and the resources necessary to create something extraordinary. In the competitive world of the Hellenistic kingdoms, such visual statements mattered. Cities often expressed their achievements through architecture and public art, and the Colossus was one of the most dramatic examples of this tradition. At the same time, the statue existed within the ordinary rhythms of daily life. Fishermen set out from the harbor before sunrise, merchants opened their shops along the streets leading away from the port, and craftsmen worked in small workshops repairing tools, shaping metal, or building ship components. The statue did not interrupt these activities. Instead, it formed a constant background presence above them. Its scale ensured that it could be seen from many parts of the city, yet its stillness allowed life below to continue without disturbance. During festivals dedicated to Helios, however, the connection between the statue and the city's religious life became more visible. Offerings and ceremonies honoring the sun god were part of Rhodian tradition, and the monument strengthened the symbolic presence of the deity within the urban landscape. For citizens participating in these rituals, the statue served as a reminder that the city's prosperity and survival were believed to be linked with divine protection. The Colossus therefore functioned on several levels at once. It was a work of art created by skilled craftsmen, a religious dedication to the patron god of the island, and a public symbol of the city's resilience after the siege of Demetrius. It also became part of the stories that travelers carried with them when they left Rhodes. Merchants departing the harbor often spoke about the remarkable bronze statue they had seen rising above the port. These stories traveled along the same maritime routes that carried cargo and passengers. In this way, the reputation of the Colossus gradually spread throughout the Mediterranean. People who had never visited Rhodes began hearing about the enormous statue dedicated to the sun god. Over time, the monument came to represent more than a single city. It became a symbol of the ingenuity and ambition of the Hellenistic world itself. Yet despite the growing fame of the statue, its life within the city remained calm and steady. Year followed year as trade continued, ships arrived and departed, and the bronze figure of Helios stood watching over the harbor. Few could have predicted that the monument, which had taken 12 years to build, would face destruction far sooner than anyone expected. For several decades after its completion, the Colossus of Rhodes stood quietly above the harbor while the life of the city continued to unfold beneath it. Generations of sailors arrived and departed under the watch of the bronze figure of Helios, and the monument gradually became woven into the identity of the island. The statue had been built as a response to a moment of danger, yet the years that followed were marked largely by stability. Rhodes remained an important maritime power in the eastern Mediterranean, maintaining its reputation for skilled navigation, reliable trade, and respected maritime law. Ships continued to arrive from Egypt, Asia Minor, and the islands of the Aegean, bringing goods that flowed through the warehouses and markets of the harbor district. The presence of the Colossus did not alter the practical routines of this trade, but it shaped the atmosphere of the city in subtle ways. The towering image of Helios reminded both residents and visitors that Rhodes had endured a great challenge and had chosen to commemorate that survival through art rather than conquest. During these decades, the statue stood through countless ordinary moments that history rarely records. Storms passed across the Aegean while waves struck the harbour walls below. Merchants argued over prices in crowded markets. Sailors repaired sails after long journeys at sea. Children grew up in the streets of the city with the immense bronze figure always visible somewhere above the rooftops. Over time, what had once been an extraordinary new monument gradually became part of the familiar skyline. Travelers visiting Rhodes might still pause to admire the statue, but for the people who lived there, it became a quiet constant in their surroundings. Even so, the Colossus remained a reminder of the delicate balance between human achievement and the forces of nature. The island of Rhodes lies within a region where the earth itself is often restless. The eastern Mediterranean sits near several active geological zones, and earthquakes were not unknown to the people of the ancient world. Historical records from different parts of Greece and Asia Minor describe cities damaged by tremors that arrived without warning. Buildings that seemed strong could be shaken apart in moments. Temples, houses, and city walls all depended on the stability of the ground beneath them. For many years, however, Rhodes appeared fortunate. The city continued to prosper, while the Colossus remained standing above the harbour. Its bronze surfaces slowly changed in appearance as exposure to air and salt from the nearby sea affected the metal. Over time, bronze develops a darker tone and sometimes a greenish surface layer known today as patina. This natural process protects the metal from deeper corrosion, but it also changes the way the statue reflects light. The shining surface that travelers may have seen when the statue was first completed likely softened with age, giving the figure a darker and more weathered appearance. Even so, its immense scale ensured that it remained one of the most striking features of the city. The monument had been designed with careful attention to balance and structure, yet no ancient builder could fully control the natural forces that shaped the landscape over centuries. The Colossus had survived winds from the sea and the slow passage of time, but the ground beneath Rhodes was not entirely still. The people of the city could not know that the stability they had experienced for decades would eventually give way to a sudden and violent change. Somewhere in the middle of the 3rd century BCE, the quiet continuity of life in Rhodes was interrupted by an event that no monument, no matter how carefully built, could easily withstand. Ancient writers later recorded that a powerful earthquake struck the island around the year 226 BCE. Such tremors could arrive without warning, shaking the foundations of buildings and causing structures to collapse within moments. When the ground itself began to move, the towering statue that had stood above the harbour for decades faced the ultimate test of its strength. For many years, the Colossus had symbolized endurance and stability, yet in the presence of a major earthquake, even the greatest monuments of the ancient world could prove fragile. The statue that had taken more than a decade to build was about to face the event that would change its fate forever. Sometime around the year 226 BCE, the island of Rhodes experienced an event that ancient people understood only through its consequences. There were no instruments to measure the movement of the earth, no scientific explanations for the shifting of tectonic plates beneath the sea. Yet the people of the ancient Mediterranean were familiar with the sudden violence of earthquakes. Cities across Greece and Asia Minor had been damaged by tremors in the past, and many communities knew that the ground beneath them could sometimes move without warning. On that particular day in Rhodes, life in the harbour city was unfolding much as it always had. Ships entered and left the port, merchants conducted their business, and citizens moved through the streets beneath the familiar presence of the Colossus of Helios. Then the earth began to shake. At first, the tremor may have felt like a distant vibration beneath the ground. Ancient descriptions of earthquakes often begin with this subtle movement, a deep rumbling that grows stronger with each passing moment. Within seconds, the shaking intensifies. Buildings creak under stress, walls crack, and objects fall from shelves and tables. In a city built largely from stone and timber, the movement of the earth could quickly turn into destruction. The earthquake that struck Rhodes was powerful enough to damage significant parts of the city. Ancient sources indicate that sections of the harbor installations and defensive structures were affected, and many buildings were damaged or destroyed. Amid this chaos stood the Colossus of Rhodes, the enormous bronze figure that had watched over the harbor for more than half a century. For decades it had remained stable, supported by its internal framework of iron and stone reinforcement. Yet even a carefully designed structure faces enormous strain during a major earthquake. The ground beneath the statue would have shifted violently, sending waves of motion upward through the monument's foundation and into the towering bronze figure above. Ancient writers later recorded that the statue broke at the knees during the earthquake. This detail appears in several classical references and suggests the point where structural stress became too great for the monument to withstand. The legs of the statue carried the entire weight of the upper body, including the torso, arms, and head, rising high above the city. When the earth moved beneath the base, the stress concentrated along the lower sections of the structure. The bronze plates and iron framework that had supported the statue for decades could not fully absorb the sudden forces created by the quake. At that moment, the immense figure that had defined the skyline of Rhodes began to fail. When the legs gave way, the upper portion of the statue collapsed. The fall of such a large structure must have been dramatic. A monument more than 30 meters tall does not fall quietly. The breaking of bronze plates, the snapping of internal supports, and the impact of heavy metal sections striking the ground would have produced a sound heard across the harbor district. Dust and fragments likely filled the air as the statue crashed down. The once upright image of Helios, which had symbolized strength and endurance, now lay broken on the ground near the place where it had stood for decades. For the citizens of Rhodes witnessing the destruction of their city, the fall of the Colossus must have carried both practical and emotional significance. The earthquake itself had already caused widespread damage. Homes, public buildings, and parts of the harbor infrastructure required urgent attention. Amid this larger crisis, the loss of the statue added another layer to the disaster. The monument had represented gratitude, resilience, and identity for the island. Seeing it shattered by the forces of nature would have reminded the people of Rhodes that even the most ambitious human creations remain vulnerable to the power of the earth. Yet the destruction of the Colossus did not erase its presence entirely. The enormous fragments of the statue remained where they had fallen. Instead of standing above the harbor, the broken sections of bronze now lay across the ground, their immense scale still visible to anyone who approached them. In an unexpected way, the fallen monument continued to attract attention. The Colossus was no longer upright, but its story was far from over. In the days following the earthquake of 226 BCE, the city of Rhodes faced a difficult task. Much of the damage caused by the tremor required immediate attention. Houses had collapsed, sections of the harbor were damaged, and parts of the city's defenses needed repair. The Rhodians were an experienced maritime society accustomed to responding to crises, and the work of rebuilding began quickly. Workers cleared debris from streets, repaired structures essential for trade, and restored the harbor installations that allowed ships to dock and unload cargo. The city's economy depended on these facilities, and returning the port to working order was essential for the survival of Rhodes. Amid these urgent repairs, the fallen Colossus lay where it had collapsed. The immense fragments of bronze scattered near the base of the statue must have been an extraordinary sight. The legs had broken at the knees, and the upper parts of the statue had fallen onto the ground. Although the monument was no longer standing, its scale remained astonishing. Ancient writers later noted that the size of the statue was still impressive, even in ruin. The broken pieces of bronze were so large that visitors could walk among them and observe details that would have been impossible to see when the statue stood upright high above the city. The destruction of the Colossus naturally raised a question among the people of Rhodes. Should the statue be rebuilt? The city had once invested 12 years of labor and considerable resources into its construction. The monument had symbolized both gratitude to Helios and the memory of the Rhodian victory over the siege of Demetrius. Rebuilding the statue might have seemed like a natural way to restore that symbol. Yet, the Rhodians did not immediately begin such a project. Ancient sources suggest that the possibility of rebuilding the statue was seriously considered. According to later accounts preserved by classical writers, the Rhodians consulted the Oracle of Delphi, one of the most respected religious authorities in the Greek world. The oracle was believed to speak with divine guidance, offering advice on matters of great importance. When the Rhodians asked whether they should restore the fallen statue, the response they received reportedly warned against rebuilding it. The explanation given in later traditions suggested that Helios himself might have been displeased by the statue or by the attempt to rebuild it. Whether the exact wording of the oracle's message was preserved accurately is difficult for modern historians to confirm. Ancient oracles often spoke in ambiguous phrases that could be interpreted in different ways. However, the story of the oracle appears frequently in historical discussions of the Colossus, and it helps explain why the Rhodians ultimately chose not to reconstruct the monument. In a deeply religious society, where divine favor was believed to influence the fate of cities, ignoring such guidance could have been seen as risky. Practical considerations may also have played a role. Rebuilding a statue of such enormous size would have required tremendous effort and resources. The city had just experienced a destructive earthquake and was already engaged in rebuilding essential structures. Restoring homes, public buildings, and harbor facilities may have taken priority over constructing another monumental statue. Even for a prosperous trading city like Rhodes, organizing a second project of that scale might have seemed difficult after the disaster. As a result, the Colossus remained where it had fallen. The broken fragments of bronze were left on the ground, rather than melted down or removed. In time, the ruins themselves became a kind of attraction. Travelers visiting Rhodes in the centuries that followed described the fallen statue with the same sense of wonder that earlier visitors had expressed toward the standing monument. The enormous pieces of bronze lying across the earth allowed observers to see the statue's scale more directly than before. One of the most famous descriptions comes from the Roman writer Pliny the Elder, who lived in the 1st century CE, nearly 300 years after the earthquake. Pliny wrote that even while lying on the ground, the statue remained astonishing to those who saw it. He remarked that few people could wrap their arms around one of the statue's fingers, an observation that highlights the enormous scale of the monument's design. This detail suggests that the ruins of the Colossus continued to impress visitors long after its fall. For generations, the remains of the statue lay quietly near the harbor of Rhodes. The monument that had once dominated the skyline was now part of the landscape at ground level. Yet the story of the Colossus did not end with its collapse. In an unexpected way, the fallen statue continued to shape the reputation of Rhodes across the ancient world. In the years and centuries that followed the earthquake, the fallen Colossus of Rhodes remained where it had collapsed. The Rhodians did not remove the enormous fragments of bronze. They did not attempt to melt them down for new statues or weapons, and they did not rebuild the monument that had once stood above the harbor. Instead, the broken figure of Helios stayed on the ground, its massive pieces scattered near the place where the statue had once risen toward the sky. Over time, the fallen Colossus became something unusual in the ancient world, a ruined monument that continued to attract admiration. Visitors who came to Rhodes in the centuries after the earthquake often made a point of seeing the remains of the statue. In the ancient Mediterranean, travel was not uncommon for merchants, diplomats, soldiers, and scholars. Ports like Rhodes received people from many regions, and stories about remarkable places circulated along the same trade routes that carried goods across the sea. By the time later Greek and Roman writers described the island, the Colossus had already been lying in ruins for generations. Yet its reputation had not disappeared. In some ways, the sight of the broken statue may have made an even stronger impression than the standing monument once had. Ancient writers occasionally described the remains of the statue to emphasize its enormous scale. Among the most well-known accounts is that of Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE. Pliny recorded that even in its fallen state, the statue continued to inspire wonder among those who saw it. According to his description, the fingers of the statue were so large that only a few people could place their arms around them at once. This observation gives a sense of the extraordinary proportions of the monument. When the statue had stood upright, those enormous details would have been far above the ground and difficult to observe closely. Once the statue collapsed, however, visitors could walk among the fragments and see the immense bronze pieces from only a few steps away. The remains likely included large sections of the torso, limbs, and other parts of the statue's outer bronze surface. Because the Colossus had been constructed from multiple bronze plates attached to an internal framework, the collapse probably caused these sections to separate or bend as they struck the ground. Some pieces may have remained partially connected, while others lay apart from the main body of the statue. The internal iron supports and stones that had once helped stabilize the structure may also have been visible among the ruins. For those who examined the remains, the fallen statue offered a rare opportunity to see the inner construction of a monumental bronze sculpture. Despite its destruction, the Colossus continued to serve as a reminder of the engineering achievements of the Hellenistic world. Even lying on the ground, the statue demonstrated the ambition of the Rhodians who had once commissioned it. The monument had been designed to represent Helios, but it had also become a symbol of human craftsmanship. The ruins, therefore, carried two meanings at once. They reflected both the creative ability of ancient builders and the vulnerability of even the greatest monuments when faced with the forces of nature. Over the generations, the presence of the fallen statue became part of the identity of Rhodes. Travelers who visited the island expected to see the remains of the famous monument, and guides or local residents likely shared the story of the siege that had led to its construction. The statue had originally been built from the sale of the siege machines left behind by Demetrius Poliorcetes, and the memory of that event continued to shape the story told about the monument. In this way, the ruins preserved not only the physical remains of the statue but also the narrative of the city's survival. For hundreds of years, the fragments of the Colossus remained in place. Empires rose and fell across the Mediterranean during this time. Greek kingdoms gave way to Roman influence, and new political powers appeared across the region. Through all these changes, the broken statue remained quietly on the island of Rhodes, visited by travelers and described by writers who sought to record the wonders of the ancient world. Yet the story of the Colossus was still not finished. Long after the earthquake that had brought it down, another historical moment would finally remove the remains of the statue from the landscape of Rhodes. The bronze fragments that had survived for centuries were destined to disappear, leaving behind only written descriptions and the memory of a monument that had once stood among the greatest achievements of the ancient world. For centuries after the earthquake, the remains of the Colossus of Rhodes lay quietly where they had fallen. Generations passed while the fragments of the enormous bronze statue remained scattered near the harbor. Travelers continued to visit the island and observe the broken pieces of what had once been one of the tallest statues of the ancient world. Writers of the Greek and Roman periods described the ruins with a sense of admiration, noting that even in destruction, the monument still conveyed the ambition of the people who had built it. Time moved forward across the Mediterranean, while the Colossus remained part of the Rhodian landscape. Empires changed, rulers came and went, and the political map of the region gradually transformed. Yet for a remarkably long period, the remains of the statue were left undisturbed. During these centuries, Rhodes itself experienced shifts in power that reflected the broader changes of the ancient world. After the Hellenistic kingdoms that followed Alexander the Great gradually declined, the expanding influence of Rome reached across the eastern Mediterranean. Rhodes developed a complex relationship with the Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire. At times, the island maintained considerable autonomy, especially because of its reputation as a center of maritime law and navigation. Roman leaders respected Rhodian expertise in naval matters, and the island's ports continued to serve as important stops along trade routes linking different regions of the empire. Throughout the Roman period, the fallen Colossus still remained visible to visitors. Roman travelers, scholars, and officials passing through Rhodes could see the enormous bronze fragments that had once formed the statue of Helios. The monument had already existed in ruin for centuries by this time, yet its reputation endured. Writers such as Pliny the Elder preserved descriptions of the statue that helped ensure its place in historical memory. Through these written accounts, the Colossus gradually became known across the wider world as one of the most remarkable monuments ever created by the Greeks. Even as political control of the Mediterranean shifted, Rhodes remained a city connected to maritime networks. Ships traveling between the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire and the Greek mainland continued to pass through its harbors. Trade did not disappear simply because empires changed. Grain, textiles, metals, and many other goods still moved along the same sea routes that had been active during the Hellenistic period. The harbor of Rhodes therefore remained busy long after the Colossus had fallen. Over time, however, the political and military environment of the Mediterranean slowly evolved. The Roman Empire itself transformed as centuries passed, eventually dividing into eastern and western regions. Rhodes became part of the eastern half of this world, governed from Constantinople, the capital of what historians later call the Byzantine Empire. During this long era, the island continued to function as a maritime outpost within the broader network of Mediterranean trade and communication. Yet the 7th century brought new challenges to the eastern Mediterranean. Political and military forces emerging from the Arabian Peninsula began expanding rapidly across territories that had once been controlled by the Byzantine Empire. These movements reshaped the balance of power across the region. Armies and fleets associated with the early Islamic caliphates launched campaigns that reached into Syria, Egypt, and eventually across many coastal areas of the Mediterranean. According to later historical traditions, one of these campaigns eventually reached the island of Rhodes. In the middle of the 7th century, forces associated with the Umayyad Caliphate reportedly captured the island for a period of time. The exact details of these events are not always clear in surviving records, and historians continue to examine the sources carefully. However, several later accounts describe a moment when the long-standing remains of the Colossus finally disappeared from the island. By this time, the statue had been lying in ruins for nearly 900 years. The bronze fragments that once formed the towering figure of Helios were still present on Rhodes, a silent reminder of the monument that had once stood above the harbor. What had survived earthquakes, centuries of weather, and countless political changes was now approaching the final stage of its story. The pieces of the Colossus had remained in place for almost a millennium, but the next chapter would determine whether those fragments would continue to exist or vanish entirely from the landscape of Rhodes. When later historians tried to explain what finally happened to the remains of the Colossus of Rhodes, they often repeated a story that has become one of the most famous episodes connected to the monument's disappearance. According to several medieval sources written centuries after the events themselves, the fragments of the statue remained on the island until the 7th century, when Rhodes was briefly captured during the expansion of the early Islamic caliphates across the eastern Mediterranean. These campaigns reshaped the political landscape of the region, bringing new powers into territories that had long been connected to the Byzantine Empire. In this changing world, Rhodes was no longer simply a trading city known for maritime law and navigation. It became one of many strategic islands whose harbors and coastal positions were valuable for controlling sea routes. Some historical traditions claim that after the island was captured, the bronze remains of the Colossus were eventually sold as scrap metal to a merchant. The story appears most clearly in later Byzantine chronicles and in writings produced during the medieval period. According to these accounts, the enormous fragments of bronze were gathered together and transported away from the island. One detail repeated in these stories is particularly striking. The metal from the statue was said to have been carried away using hundreds of camels, sometimes described as 900 animals loaded with pieces of bronze. The image is vivid, a long caravan moving across the landscape, each animal carrying a portion of what had once been one of the most celebrated statues of the ancient world. For many readers of these historical accounts, this detail became a powerful symbol of the Colossus's final disappearance. The monument that had once stood above the harbour of Rhodes was reduced to raw material, broken into fragments and transported away for reuse. Bronze was an extremely valuable resource in the ancient and medieval worlds. Metal could be melted down and used to create tools, weapons, statues, or other objects. From a practical perspective, recycling large quantities of bronze would have been economically sensible. Yet modern historians approach this story with caution. The accounts describing the caravan of camels were written several centuries after the supposed event. Because of this time gap, it is difficult to confirm exactly how accurate these details may be. Some scholars believe the story may have been exaggerated or shaped by later storytelling traditions. The image of hundreds of camels carrying pieces of a legendary statue may have appealed to the imagination of writers who wanted to illustrate the dramatic end of the monument. Others suggest that while the numbers may be uncertain, the general idea that the bronze fragments were eventually removed and reused is plausible. What remains clear is that the physical remains of the Colossus eventually disappeared from Rhodes. The fragments that had once impressed Roman visitors like Pliny the Elder were no longer present in later centuries. Whether they were removed during a specific event in the 7th century or gradually taken away over time is still debated among historians. Ancient monuments often experienced long periods of gradual dismantling as materials were reused in new construction projects. The disappearance of the bronze fragments marked the final physical stage of the Colossus's story. For nearly 900 years after the earthquake, the remains of the statue had continued to attract attention. Even lying on the ground, the Colossus had reminded visitors of the ambition of the people who built it. Once the bronze pieces were gone, however, the monument existed only in written descriptions and in the memory of those who had heard its story. Yet, in another sense, the Colossus had already begun a different kind of life long before its fragments vanished. The statue had become part of a tradition of storytelling about the greatest achievements of the ancient world. Travelers, scholars, and writers began to group it together with other remarkable monuments, creating a list that would become famous across centuries. Through these lists, the Colossus of Rhodes would take its place among what later generations came to call the 7 wonders of the ancient world. By the time the last physical traces of the Colossus disappeared from Rhodes, the monument had already begun to live a different kind of existence. Its bronze fragments may have vanished from the island, but its reputation had traveled far beyond the harbor where it once stood. Long before the medieval stories about the statue's disappearance were written down, writers of the ancient Greek world had already begun describing remarkable structures that represented the greatest achievements of human craftsmanship. These descriptions gradually formed what later generations would call the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The idea of listing the most impressive monuments of the world likely began with travelers and scholars who moved through the eastern Mediterranean during the Hellenistic period. This region contained many extraordinary constructions, temples dedicated to powerful gods, tombs built for influential rulers, and massive engineering works that reshaped entire landscapes. Visitors who encountered these structures often wrote about them, recording their impressions so that others could imagine what they had seen. Over time, some writers began gathering these monuments into lists that highlighted the most remarkable examples of architecture and sculpture known to their world. Among the earliest figures associated with these lists was the Greek writer Antipater of Sidon, who lived in the 2nd century BCE. Antipater composed a poem that described several extraordinary monuments, praising their scale and beauty. His writing did not present a fixed list exactly as it appears today, but it helped shape the tradition of identifying certain structures as the greatest wonders known to the Greek world. Other writers followed similar traditions, producing variations of the list as they described famous landmarks across the Mediterranean. The Colossus of Rhodes appeared regularly among these monuments. Even though the statue had stood for only a relatively short period of time before its collapse, its enormous scale and the story of its construction captured the imagination of those who heard about it. The monument represented something that few cities had attempted, a bronze statue rising more than 30 meters into the sky, built not to honor a ruler, but to celebrate the survival of an entire community. For many writers, this ambition alone justified its place among the greatest creations of the ancient world. The other monuments that eventually formed the traditional list reflected similar achievements. The Great Pyramid at Giza demonstrated the engineering abilities of ancient Egypt. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon were said to represent a remarkable feat of landscape architecture. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus displayed the artistic and architectural skill of the Greek world. The statue of Zeus at Olympia, created by the sculptor Phidias, showed how religious devotion and artistic mastery could combine to produce an unforgettable image. The mausoleum at Halicarnassus illustrated the power and prestige of royal tomb architecture. The lighthouse of Alexandria guided ships safely into one of the busiest ports of the Mediterranean. In this company of monumental achievements, the Colossus of Rhodes represented the world of large-scale sculpture. Unlike many of the other wonders, it did not survive long enough for many generations to see it standing. Yet its reputation endured precisely because it had once existed. The memory of the statue remained vivid in historical writing, even when the monument itself had disappeared from the landscape. Lists of the seven wonders were not fixed in a single official form during antiquity. Different writers sometimes arranged the monuments in different orders or emphasized particular features that impressed them most, yet the Colossus almost always appeared among them. Its combination of engineering, ambition, artistic design, and dramatic history ensured that it remained part of the story people told about the greatest works of human creativity. In a quiet way, this meant that the Colossus achieved a kind of permanence that bronze alone could never guarantee. The statue that had once stood above the harbor of Rhodes existed physically for little more than half a century. After the earthquake, its remains lay on the ground for many centuries more before eventually disappearing. Yet through the words of travelers, historians, and poets, the memory of the monument continued to move across time. Even after the bronze itself had vanished, the Colossus remained part of the shared imagination of the ancient world, remembered as one of the greatest wonders people had ever attempted to build. Long after the bronze of the Colossus had vanished from Rhodes, the image of the statue continued to grow in the imagination of later generations. This transformation is one of the most curious parts of the monument's story. The physical structure had disappeared, yet the mental picture people carried of it became larger and more dramatic over time. As centuries passed, writers, artists, and travelers tried to reconstruct the appearance of the statue using fragments of information preserved in ancient texts. Because the original monument no longer existed, these reconstructions were shaped not only by evidence but also by imagination. During the medieval period, knowledge of many ancient monuments survived mainly through written descriptions, copied and preserved by scholars. The Colossus of Rhodes was mentioned in several texts that circulated through Byzantine and later European intellectual traditions. These references reminded readers that a gigantic bronze statue of Helios had once stood near the harbor of Rhodes and that it had been counted among the wonders of the ancient world. Yet the details about its exact appearance were limited. Ancient authors had written about the statue's height and its dramatic collapse in the earthquake of 226 BCE, but they left few descriptions of its precise pose or architectural setting. This absence of detail created space for interpretation. As interest in the classical world revived during the Renaissance in Europe, artists and scholars began searching ancient texts for inspiration. The rediscovery of Greek and Roman literature encouraged painters and engravers to imagine what lost monuments might have looked like. Among these monuments, the Colossus of Rhodes attracted particular attention. The idea of a statue more than 30 meters tall overlooking a Mediterranean harbor seemed almost mythical, and artists attempted to visualize it in ways that would impress viewers. It was during this period that the famous image of the Colossus standing across the entrance of the harbor began to appear more frequently in European art. In these illustrations, the statue was shown with its legs spread widely apart, one foot placed on each side of the harbor mouth, while ships sailed beneath it. The figure often held a torch or shield, and its head was crowned with rays representing the sun god Helios. The pose suggested immense strength and control over the harbor below. For viewers who had never seen the island of Rhodes and had little access to archaeological evidence, this image felt convincing and powerful. The popularity of this representation spread quickly through printed books and engravings. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the harbor-straddling Colossus had become one of the most widely recognized depictions of the monument. Illustrations appeared in travel accounts, encyclopedias, and collections describing the wonders of the ancient world. Each new image reinforced the same dramatic vision, a giant bronze figure standing above the sea, like a gateway between the land and the open Mediterranean. Yet historians who study the ancient sources carefully notice something important. None of the early Greek or Roman writers who mentioned the Colossus ever described it standing across the harbor entrance. The earliest descriptions focus on the statue's height and on the fact that it broke at the knees during the earthquake. If the monument had actually straddled the harbor, such an extraordinary detail would almost certainly have appeared in those early accounts. Its absence suggests that the famous image may have been created many centuries after the statue itself had disappeared. Modern historians, therefore, see the Renaissance image of the harbor-straddling Colossus as an example of how historical memory can evolve over time. Artists, working with incomplete information, tried to imagine the most dramatic version of the monument possible. Their illustrations were not intended to deceive readers. They were attempts to visualize a structure that no longer existed. Yet because these images became so widely distributed, they gradually shaped the way people around the world imagined the Colossus of Rhodes. In this way, the monument acquired two parallel histories. One belonged to the real statue built in the 3rd century BCE by the Rhodians, standing near the harbor as a symbol of survival and gratitude to Helios. The other existed in art and imagination, where the Colossus became an enormous guardian straddling the sea itself. The contrast between these two images reveals how the memory of the ancient world can change as it passes through different cultures and centuries. Once the image of the Colossus standing across the harbor began to appear in European art, it quickly became one of the most recognizable visual interpretations of the ancient world. The idea was simple and dramatic. A statue so enormous that ships could pass between its legs captured the imagination of viewers in a way that a more realistic reconstruction might not. Artists who illustrated books about the wonders of the ancient world were not always historians or archaeologists. Their goal was often to inspire curiosity and awe. The harbor-straddling Colossus achieved that effect immediately. The image communicated scale in a way that required no explanation. Anyone looking at the scene could instantly understand that this statue was meant to be one of the greatest achievements of ancient engineering. Printing technology played an important role in spreading this image. During the Renaissance and early modern period, illustrated books became increasingly popular in Europe. Collections describing the 7 wonders of the ancient world were printed and reprinted, often including engraved images that attempted to reconstruct monuments lastingly popular in Europe. Collections describing the 7 wonders of the ancient world were printed and reprinted, often including engraved images that attempted to reconstruct monuments lost to time. Each time a new edition appeared, the engravings were copied, modified, or adapted by different artists. The harbor-straddling Colossus gradually became the standard illustration used in these publications. Readers who encountered the image in one book often saw the same scene repeated in others, reinforcing the impression that this must have been the true appearance of the statue. Over time, the image moved beyond scholarly texts and into broader cultural imagination. Artists painted it, mapmakers decorated their charts with it, and storytellers referred to it when describing the marvels of antiquity. The Colossus began to appear not only as a historical monument, but also as a symbol of human ambition. The dramatic stance of the statue made it feel almost mythical, as if the figure of Helios had been placed there to guard the entrance to the harbor itself. Yet while the image spread widely, historians continued examining the surviving ancient sources more carefully. Scholars compared descriptions written by classical authors, such as Strabo, Pliny the Elder, and others who had recorded information about the statue. These sources provided valuable clues about the monument's height, construction, and collapse. At the same time, they revealed what was missing. None of the early texts mentioned ships sailing between the statue's legs or described the monument spanning the harbor entrance. The silence of these sources raised questions for researchers who wanted to understand the statue more accurately. Archaeology and engineering studies also contributed to this discussion. When modern scholars considered the technology available in the 3rd century BCE, the harbor-spanning design appeared increasingly unlikely. A statue constructed from bronze plates and supported by an internal framework would face enormous structural stress if its legs were spread across a wide harbor channel. Even with modern materials, building such a structure would require careful engineering. For ancient builders working with the tools and materials of their time, the challenge would have been far greater. The more historians studied the problem, the clearer it became that the famous image from Renaissance art was probably an imaginative reconstruction rather than a historical one. Despite this growing understanding among scholars, the dramatic illustration did not disappear from popular culture. Once an image becomes widely recognized, it often continues to shape public imagination long after historians revise their interpretations. Films, educational illustrations, and even modern digital artwork frequently return to the harbor-straddling version of the Colossus because it remains visually powerful. The image communicates the idea of a wonder instantly, even if it does not match the most likely historical reality. This situation reveals something interesting about the relationship between history and memory. The Colossus of Rhodes existed as a real monument built by the people of a specific city in a specific historical moment. Yet the statue also became a symbol that evolved across centuries as different cultures imagined it in new ways. The artistic version created during the Renaissance may not represent the true form of the monument, but it shows how later generations tried to connect with the ancient world through creativity and storytelling. In the end, both versions of the Colossus tell part of the story. One belongs to the historical city of Rhodes, where a bronze statue of Helios once stood near the harbor for only a few decades before falling in an earthquake. The other belongs to the long history of human imagination, where the statue grew taller, more dramatic, and more legendary with each passing century. The story of the Colossus of Rhodes reveals something deeper than the history of a single monument. It shows how human memory gradually reshapes the past. When a structure disappears but its story survives, people begin to fill the empty spaces with imagination. The Colossus stood for only a few decades before the earthquake brought it down, yet its memory traveled through centuries in the writings of historians, travelers, and poets. As those centuries passed, the details of the monument became less certain, while the idea of it grew larger and more dramatic. This process is not unique to the Colossus. Many ancient monuments have experienced a similar transformation. When people encounter ruins or read about structures that no longer exist, they often try to picture them in the most impressive way possible. The imagination naturally enlarges what it cannot see. A statue described as enormous may become gigantic in the mind. A building known to have been beautiful may be imagined as perfect. The farther a monument moves from living memory, the more space there is for interpretation and creativity. In the case of the Colossus, this transformation was encouraged by the statue's very nature. It had been one of the tallest statues in the ancient world, rising more than 30 meters above the harbor of Rhodes. Even when ancient writers described its height in careful measurements, readers in later centuries struggled to visualize what such a monument would truly look like. Without drawings, photographs, or surviving ruins standing upright, the imagination had to supply the missing image. Artists responded by creating versions of the statue that expressed the grandeur they believed the monument deserved. The harbor-straddling Colossus that appeared in Renaissance illustrations was one result of this process. The image captured the spirit of a wonder, even if it did not accurately represent the structure itself. For viewers of those illustrations, the statue seemed powerful enough to command the sea. Ships sailing between its legs suggested control over the harbor and the surrounding waters. The monument appeared not merely as a statue, but almost as a guardian of the city, yet the quieter historical reality may be just as remarkable. The real Colossus was not built as a theatrical display of domination over the sea. It was constructed by a community that had recently survived a major siege. The statue honored Helios, the patron god of Rhodes, and expressed gratitude for the city's survival. Its size reflected the determination of the Rhodians to create a monument that would remind future generations of that moment in their history. The statue stood near the harbor, not to block ships, but to greet them. Understanding this difference helps reveal how monuments function in two ways. First, they exist physically as structures built by human hands. Their materials, construction methods, and locations belong to a specific historical context. Second, they exist symbolically in the stories people tell about them. Once a monument enters the shared imagination of many cultures, its meaning can grow beyond its original form. For the Colossus of Rhodes, this symbolic life became far longer than its physical existence. The statue itself stood for little more than half a century before the earthquake caused it to collapse. Even its broken remains eventually disappeared from the island. Yet the idea of the Colossus continued to travel across time. Writers preserved its story in descriptions of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Artists recreated it in paintings and engravings. Generations who had never seen Rhodes or the Mediterranean Sea still learned the name of the statue. In this sense, the Colossus became something more than a lost monument. It became an example of how human beings remember achievement. The statue represented the ability of a small island city to create something extraordinary. Even after the bronze had vanished, the idea of that achievement remained. The monument that once stood beside the harbor of Rhodes continued to exist in the imagination of people who encountered its story centuries later. Even though the Colossus of Rhodes no longer exists, historians and engineers continue to study it with genuine curiosity. The statue stood for only a few decades in the 3rd century BCE, yet it still raises an important question. How were ancient builders able to create something so large using the tools and materials available to them? When modern researchers examine the surviving descriptions of the monument, they often approach it not only as a work of art, but also as a remarkable example of early engineering. In the ancient world, most statues were far smaller. Sculptors regularly created figures of athletes, gods, and heroes that stood at human height or slightly larger. These works required skill and experience, but they did not demand the same structural solutions needed for a monument more than 30 meters tall. The Colossus of Rhodes belonged to an entirely different category of construction. Its builders were attempting something closer to architecture than ordinary sculpture. A statue of that size needed foundations, internal supports, and carefully calculated weight distribution, much like a building. Bronze itself played a crucial role in making such a monument possible. Unlike stone, bronze can be cast into thin plates and shaped into curved forms that imitate the human body. Greek sculptors had been working with bronze for centuries before the Colossus was built. They had developed techniques for casting separate pieces of metal and joining them together to form a larger structure. This method allowed artists to produce statues that appeared natural and balanced. However, scaling this technique to the size of the Colossus required extraordinary planning. Instead of casting the statue as a single piece, the builders likely created many individual bronze sections. These pieces formed the outer skin of the statue, attached to an internal framework made of iron supports. Inside the structure, stones may have been used to help stabilize the weight of the monument. The internal frame distributed the mass of the statue downward into the foundation, preventing the bronze plates from carrying the entire load themselves. In this way, the Colossus functioned like a hollow shell supported by a hidden structure. This approach reflects the ingenuity of Hellenistic engineering. By the 3rd century BCE, builders across the Mediterranean were experimenting with increasingly ambitious construction techniques. Large temples, fortified walls, and harbor installations all required careful organization and planning. The creation of the Colossus shows that sculptors and engineers were capable of combining artistic design with structural thinking. The statue had to look like a human figure while also behaving like a stable architectural structure. The location of Rhodes made this achievement even more impressive. The island stood along busy maritime routes, meaning that the statue was constantly exposed to wind from the sea. Coastal environments can be challenging for large monuments. Salt, carried by sea air, slowly interacts with metal surfaces, while strong winds place pressure on tall structures. The builders of the Colossus therefore needed to ensure that the statue could remain stable despite these environmental conditions. Modern engineers sometimes compare the Colossus to later monumental statues, such as the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. Although separated by more than 2,000 years, both monuments rely on a similar principle, a metal outer surface supported by an internal structural framework. The technologies used in the 19th century were far more advanced, yet the underlying concept demonstrates that ancient builders were already exploring ideas that would later appear in modern engineering. What makes the Colossus particularly fascinating is that it represents a moment when artistic ambition and technical knowledge met at a very high level. The statue was not created by a massive empire with unlimited resources. Instead, it was commissioned by a city that had recently defended itself during a siege. The people of Rhodes chose to express their survival not through military monuments or fortresses, but through a statue dedicated to their patron god. The result was a structure that impressed visitors from across the Mediterranean and eventually became part of the tradition of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Even though the statue no longer stands, the questions it raises continue to attract attention. How exactly were the bronze plates shaped and lifted into place? What methods were used to align the internal supports as the statue grew taller during construction? How did the builders maintain balance as the monument gradually rose above the harbor? These questions remind modern observers that the Colossus was more than a symbol. It was also a technical achievement that reveals the practical intelligence of the people who built it. Despite the remarkable skill that went into building the Colossus of Rhodes, the statue stood for only a relatively short time. From its completion around 280 BCE until the earthquake that destroyed it in 226 BCE, the monument existed for roughly 54 years. Compared with temples and stone buildings that survived for centuries, this lifespan may appear surprisingly brief. Yet, understanding why the Colossus fell so quickly requires looking at both the materials used in its construction and the unpredictable forces of the natural world. The Colossus was not carved from a single block of stone like some ancient monuments. Instead, it was built using a complex system of bronze plates attached to an internal framework. This design allowed sculptors to create a figure far larger than most statues of the time. However, the same method that made the statue possible also introduced certain structural vulnerabilities. Bronze plates were relatively thin compared with solid stone, and although the internal framework helped support them, the entire structure depended on the stability of its foundation and the strength of its supporting joints. In ordinary conditions, the design appears to have worked well. The statue stood for decades above the harbor, enduring wind from the sea and the gradual effects of weather. Bronze is a durable metal, and when exposed to air it forms a protective surface layer that slows deeper corrosion. For this reason, many bronze objects from the ancient world have survived in archaeological contexts. The Colossus, however, was not simply a bronze object. It was an enormous structure that relied on many connected parts working together in balance. The most critical part of that balance lay in the legs of the statue. Like any standing figure, the Colossus transferred the weight of its entire upper body through the legs into the foundation below. This included the mass of the torso, arms, and head, all of which were supported by the internal framework. When the statue stood upright, the weight was distributed carefully through this system of supports. If the ground beneath the statue remained stable, the structure could remain balanced for many years. An earthquake changes those conditions instantly. When the earth begins to move, the forces acting on a tall structure increase dramatically. Instead of standing quietly on a stable base, the statue is suddenly shaken from side to side as the ground shifts beneath it. Each movement sends waves of stress through the framework and the bronze plates attached to it. In such moments, the weakest structural points are often the first to fail. Ancient sources report that the Colossus broke at the knees during the earthquake. This detail makes structural sense when modern engineers consider the forces involved. The knees of the statue would have been one of the most stressed areas of the entire structure. They connected the lower legs, which were anchored to the foundation, with the massive weight of the upper body above. When the earthquake shook the ground, the movement likely caused the internal supports and bronze plates in this region to experience sudden bending forces. Once that section of the structure failed, the upper portion of the statue would have lost its support and collapsed. The height of the Colossus may also have contributed to its vulnerability. Tall structures amplify movement during earthquakes because the top of the structure can sway more dramatically than the base. Even a relatively small shift at ground level can produce much larger motion at the upper parts of a tall monument. For a statue more than 30 meters high, this effect could have been significant. The upper sections of the Colossus would have experienced strong movement during the earthquake, increasing the stress on the lower structural joints. Another factor may have been the limitations of construction techniques available at the time. The builders of the Colossus were experimenting with a scale rarely attempted in bronze sculpture. Although they demonstrated remarkable skill in creating the monument, they did not have access to modern engineering knowledge about seismic forces. The internal framework was designed to support the statue under normal conditions, but earthquakes introduce stresses that are difficult to predict without detailed structural analysis. Even so, the fact that the Colossus stood for more than half a century suggests that its builders achieved a considerable degree of success. Many ancient structures collapsed during construction or failed shortly after completion. The Colossus remained upright long enough for several generations to see it as a defining feature of Rhodes. Its destruction came not from gradual decay but from a sudden natural event that few ancient builders could have fully anticipated. In this sense, the fall of the Colossus reflects the constant tension between human ambition and natural forces. The Rhodians had created one of the most impressive statues of the ancient world using the knowledge and tools available to them. For decades, it stood as a symbol of resilience and ingenuity. Yet when the earth beneath the island shifted violently, even that extraordinary achievement proved vulnerable. When modern historians and engineers think about the Colossus of Rhodes, one question often appears naturally. If such a statue were built today, could it survive the kind of earthquake that destroyed the original monument? This question helps place the achievement of the ancient builders into a broader perspective. The people of Rhodes created a statue more than 30 meters tall using tools and materials available more than 2,000 years ago. While the monument ultimately collapsed during an earthquake, its construction still represents a remarkable level of knowledge for its time. Modern engineering approaches large monuments very differently from the methods available in the 3rd century BCE. Today, engineers carefully study the forces that affect tall structures, including wind pressure, shifting foundations, and seismic activity. Detailed mathematical models allow designers to predict how a building or statue will move when the ground shakes. Materials such as reinforced steel and modern concrete can absorb and redistribute stress far more effectively than ancient iron supports or stone reinforcement. Because of these advances, many modern structures are designed specifically to withstand earthquakes. One of the key principles used in modern earthquake-resistant construction is flexibility. Instead of resisting every movement of the ground, tall structures are often designed to move slightly with seismic vibrations. When a building can bend or sway without breaking, the forces created by an earthquake are less likely to concentrate in a single weak point. This concept is visible in modern skyscrapers, bridges, and large monuments that incorporate flexible joints or dampening systems. Such techniques were unknown to ancient builders, who typically relied on rigid structures supported by solid foundations. If a statue similar in size to the Colossus were constructed today, engineers might approach it in ways that resemble the design of modern monumental sculptures. The outer surface could still be made from metal panels, shaped to resemble the human form, much like the bronze plates used by the Rhodians. However, these panels would likely be attached to a carefully engineered steel framework capable of absorbing movement. The foundation would also be designed to distribute forces into the ground while allowing limited flexibility during seismic events. Another modern approach involves the use of internal support systems that separate the outer surface of a statue from its structural skeleton. In the case of the Statue of Liberty, for example, the copper exterior is attached to a strong iron and steel framework that carries the weight of the structure. This design allows the outer surface to move slightly without damaging the entire monument. If the Colossus had been built using a similar principle with modern materials, it might have been better prepared to survive the sudden movement caused by an earthquake. Yet even with advanced technology, constructing a monument near a coastline in an earthquake-prone region still presents challenges. Engineers must consider not only the shaking of the ground, but also the long-term effects of weather, salt carried in sea air, and gradual changes in the stability of the soil. Coastal environments can slowly weaken materials over time, especially when metal is exposed to moisture and salt. Regular maintenance and careful monitoring are therefore essential for preserving large monuments. Looking back at the Colossus with this modern perspective reveals something important about the builders of Rhodes. They were working without the scientific tools that engineers rely on today, yet they still managed to create a structure that stood for more than half a century. The statue remained stable through decades of wind, weather, and everyday environmental stress. Only a powerful earthquake strong enough to damage much of the city brought the monument down. In this light, the Colossus becomes more than a lost wonder of the ancient world. It becomes evidence of the creativity and determination of the people who built it. Their knowledge was shaped by observation, experience, and practical experimentation rather than modern scientific analysis. Even so, they were able to design a monument that pushed the limits of what was technically possible in their time. The fall of the Colossus reminds us that human achievements always exist within the larger forces of the natural world. No matter how advanced our tools become, the earth itself still moves beneath our feet. The statue that once stood above the harbor of Rhodes did not survive the earthquake of 226 BCE, yet the ambition behind its construction continues to inspire curiosity thousands of years later. By the time historians look back across the long story of the Colossus of Rhodes, one fact stands out with quiet clarity. The statue itself existed for only a brief moment in the long history of the Mediterranean. Built around 280 BCE and destroyed by an earthquake in 226 BCE, it stood for little more than half a century. Compared with monuments that survived for hundreds or even thousands of years, the physical life of the Colossus was remarkably short. Yet, its influence has lasted for more than 2 millennia. This contrast between a short physical existence and a long historical memory helps explain why the statue continues to fascinate people today. The Colossus was never intended to become one of the most famous monuments in history. When the Rhodians commissioned the statue, their goal was simple and specific. They wanted to honor Helios, the patron god of their island, and commemorate their survival after the siege led by Demetrius Poliorcetes. The monument represented gratitude and resilience rather than conquest or imperial power. It was not built to dominate neighboring lands or intimidate rival cities. Instead, it expressed the pride of a community that had defended its independence. Because of this purpose, the Colossus reflects an interesting aspect of the ancient Greek world. Many of the largest monuments in antiquity were built by powerful rulers who wanted to demonstrate their authority. Palaces, tombs, and temples often carried the names of kings and emperors. The Colossus, however, emerged from the collective decision of a city rather than the ambition of a single ruler. The Rhodians used resources gathered after the failed siege to create a monument that belonged to the entire community. In this sense, the statue represented a shared civic achievement. Even though the monument collapsed after only a few decades, its story did not disappear with it. Travelers, Historians and poets preserved the memory of the statue through written descriptions. These accounts allowed people who had never visited Rhodes to imagine the towering bronze figure that once stood above the harbor. Over time, the statue became part of a broader narrative about the most impressive creations of the ancient world. Lists describing the Seven Wonders included the Colossus, alongside temples, pyramids, and other monumental works. What makes this legacy particularly interesting is that most people who learned about the Colossus never saw it standing. By the time Roman writers described the statue, it had already been lying in ruins for centuries. Later generations encountered the monument only through stories, drawings, and historical texts, yet these descriptions proved powerful enough to keep the statue alive in cultural memory. Even after the bronze fragments disappeared from Rhodes, the idea of the monument continued to circulate. This persistence shows how monuments can exist in two different forms. One form is physical, the stone, bronze, and labor that create a structure in a specific place. The other form is historical, the memory that survives in writing, art, and shared storytelling. The Colossus of Rhodes lost its physical form long ago, but its historical form remained active across centuries of human curiosity. Today, when historians discuss the statue, they do not focus only on its size or appearance, they also consider the broader story it represents. The monument illustrates the ambitions of the Hellenistic world, a time when cities and kingdoms competed to build structures that reflected their cultural achievements. It also reminds modern observers that even the greatest creations of human craftsmanship can be fragile when confronted with natural forces. In this way, the Colossus of Rhodes becomes more than a lost statue. It becomes a symbol of how human communities respond to both success and loss. The Rhodians built the statue to celebrate survival after a dangerous siege. Later generations remembered the statue even after it had fallen. Across more than 2,000 years, the monument has continued to exist through the stories people tell about it. There is something quietly powerful about monuments that no longer exist. When people think about the Colossus of Rhodes today, they are not looking at a surviving structure like the Great Pyramid of Giza. There is no towering statue still standing beside the harbor, no ruins rising above the city that visitors can photograph or walk around. Instead, the Colossus survives almost entirely in description and imagination, and yet, this absence may be one of the reasons it continues to capture attention. When a monument disappears, it leaves behind a kind of empty space in history. People naturally try to fill that space with questions. What did it truly look like? How impressive would it have seemed to someone seeing it for the first time? What kind of effort was required to build it? These questions encourage curiosity in a way that fully preserved monuments sometimes do not. When a structure still exists, people can observe it directly. But when it has vanished, the mind must reconstruct it piece by piece using fragments of evidence. The Colossus of Rhodes represents one of the clearest examples of this process. Historians know certain facts about the statue with reasonable confidence. It stood around 70 cubits tall, which is roughly 30 to 35 meters. It was built from bronze plates, attached to an internal framework. It represented Helios, the sun god who served as the patron deity of the island, and it collapsed during an earthquake around 226 BCE, breaking at the knees and falling to the ground. Beyond these details, however, many aspects of the monument remain uncertain. The exact pose of the statue is not known. Its precise location near the harbor has been debated. Even the way the bronze plates were lifted and assembled during construction remains partly unclear. These uncertainties invite careful interpretation by historians and archaeologists, but they also invite imagination from artists and writers. This mixture of evidence and uncertainty helps explain why the Colossus has remained such a powerful subject across centuries. People are drawn not only to what is known, but also to what must be imagined. The statue becomes a puzzle assembled from historical clues. Each generation revisits those clues and tries to picture the monument again. Another reason the Colossus continues to hold attention lies in the human story behind it. The statue was not built simply as decoration. It emerged from a very specific historical moment: the successful defense of Rhodes against a powerful invading army. The Rhodians transformed the abandoned siege machines of Demetrius into the raw materials that financed the statue. In doing so, they converted the memory of war into a symbol of gratitude and resilience. This transformation gives the monument a narrative that people can easily understand even centuries later. The Colossus was not only a technical achievement, it was a reminder that a community had survived a serious threat and had chosen to commemorate that survival through art. The statue, therefore, carried both historical meaning and emotional significance. The continued fascination with the Colossus also reflects a broader human interest in the limits of ambition. Throughout history, societies have attempted to build structures that stretch the boundaries of what seems possible. Towers rise higher, statues grow larger, and engineering projects become more complex. The Colossus stands within this long tradition of human creativity pushing against practical limits. When people imagine the statue today, they are often imagining more than a piece of bronze standing beside a harbor. They are imagining the moment when a community decided to create something extraordinary, knowing that it would require years of labor and careful planning. They are imagining the determination of craftsmen who shaped metal plates and raised them higher and higher until a giant figure appeared above the city. In this way, the Colossus continues to exist not through bronze or stone, but through curiosity. Its physical form disappeared long ago, yet the questions it raises still remain active. Each person who learns about the monument becomes part of the long chain of observers who have tried to picture the statue standing once again above the harbor of Rhodes. When people think about the Colossus of Rhodes today, they are often imagining a monument that no living person has ever seen. The bronze statue disappeared from the island many centuries ago, leaving behind only written descriptions and scattered historical references. Yet the story of the monument continues to travel across time. Historians study the surviving texts. Archaeologists search for clues about the ancient harbor. Artists attempt to picture the statue in drawings and reconstructions. Each generation approaches the Colossus again, trying to understand what it meant to the people who built it. In a quiet way, this continued interest reveals something about how human beings relate to the past. The Colossus was not preserved like the pyramids of Egypt or some of the temples that still stand in Greece today. Instead, it exists almost entirely in memory and interpretation. This means that understanding the monument requires patience and careful attention to evidence. Ancient writers, such as Pliny the Elder, left valuable descriptions, but even those texts contain only fragments of the full story. Modern historians must compare these sources, examine archaeological remains around the harbor of Rhodes, and consider the engineering knowledge available in the 3rd century BCE. Through this process, the Colossus becomes more than a lost statue. It becomes a reminder of how history is reconstructed piece by piece. Every surviving text, every artifact, and every archaeological discovery adds a small detail to the picture. None of these pieces alone can recreate the monument completely, but together they allow people to approach the past with greater understanding. At the same time, the story of the Colossus offers a broader lesson about human ambition. The people of Rhodes decided to create a statue that would stand far above their city, a monument large enough to reflect their gratitude and confidence after surviving a dangerous siege. They invested years of work and resources into a project that pushed the limits of what their technology could achieve. For several decades, the statue succeeded in doing exactly what they intended. It greeted sailors approaching the harbor and reminded citizens of the moment when their city had endured a serious challenge. Yet the monument also demonstrates the limits of human creation. The earthquake that struck Rhodes in 226 BCE destroyed the statue in a matter of moments. A structure that had required more than a decade to build collapsed under the movement of the earth. Even the fragments that remained eventually disappeared centuries later. The bronze that once formed the statue was carried away and reused, leaving no visible trace of the monument that had once defined the skyline of the island. Despite this disappearance, the Colossus did not truly vanish. its story continued through the writings of historians and the traditions that describe the seven wonders of the ancient world. The monument became part of a larger narrative about the creativity and determination of ancient societies. It reminded later generations that people living thousands of years ago were capable of remarkable achievements in art, engineering, and collective effort. Today, the Colossus invites a final reflection. The statue itself lasted only a short time, but the idea behind it has endured for more than 2,000 years. A community once chose to transform the memory of war into a work of art that celebrated survival. Even though the bronze figure no longer stands above the harbor of Rhodes, the story of that decision continues to travel across time. And perhaps that raises a quiet question worth considering. If a monument can disappear while its story survives for thousands of years, what truly makes something last, the structure itself, or the meaning people choose to remember?